The hammer came down like a death sentence. Silas Whitmore didn't even look at the woman standing on the platform. He just smiled at the auctioneer, that slow, satisfied smile of a man who had already won before the game began, and raised 2 fingers. $2 for a pregnant widow and her 3 children. Like they were livestock he hadn't decided whether to bother with yet. Clara Whitmore was 6 months along. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her youngest daughter hadn't spoken in weeks, and every person in that Frost Hollow crowd looked anywhere but at her face. Nobody bid against Silas. Nobody ever did. If you've ever stood in a room where everyone knew something was wrong and nobody moved, you already know exactly how this story begins. Before we go any further, if stories about ordinary people refusing to stay broken speak to you, please subscribe right now and hit that bell. Every single week, we bring you stories like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Frost Hollow, because somebody was about to walk into that auction yard and change everything. The morning it happened, Clara Whitmore had already made her peace with losing. Not the kind of peace that comes from acceptance, the kind that comes from exhaustion, so deep it hollows a person out from the inside. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 11 weeks. Her feet were swollen inside boots that no longer fit properly. The baby moved constantly now, restless in a way that felt almost like panic, as if the child already understood that the world waiting outside was not going to be gentle. She stood on the wooden platform outside Frost Hollow's only general store and kept her eyes on Owen. Owen was 11 years old, and he was furious. He had positioned himself 3 steps in front of her, which meant he was also in front of Ben and Lucy, which meant that if anyone wanted to reach his mother and his siblings, they were going to have to go through him first. He had his fists raised, actually raised knuckles, showing, elbows bent, the way a boy raises his fists when he has no idea how to fight, but has made a decision that fighting is what the moment requires. Yes. The men in the yard thought it was almost funny. Clara did not think it was funny. She thought it was the bravest and most heartbreaking thing she had ever seen, and she had to press her lips together very hard to keep herself from making a sound that would embarrass him in front of the crowd. Ben was 7. He was standing directly behind Owen with both hands gripping the back of his brother's shirt, which may have looked like fear, but was actually Ben's way of communicating that wherever Owen went, he was going too. Ben had always been like that. The kind of child who walked into things head first without fully understanding what the thing was, powered entirely by loyalty to whoever was walking in first. Lucy was 5. She hadn't said a word since the quarry. She was pressed against Clara's side, with her face turned slightly away from the crowd, and Clara had her hand resting on top of Lucy's head, not pushing her away, not pulling her closer, just keeping contact. Just saying without words, I am still here. I am still right here. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who sweated even in cold weather, and who had the particular gift of being able to speak continuously without appearing to feel anything he said. He was listing Clara's debts. The number kept growing. She had stopped counting somewhere around the 3rd week of running when the arithmetic of her situation became so clearly unsurvivable that thinking about it further served no purpose. Caleb had been dead for 4 months. Her husband had been a quarry worker. He was not a careful man or a cautious man, but he was a good man, which in Clara's experience was the more valuable thing, and she had loved him without reservation for 9 years. The collapse that killed him also injured 2 other men. By the time those 2 men filed claims, and Silas Whitmore filed his own claims on top of theirs, there was nothing left. The house, the tools, the money Caleb had hidden in a tin beneath the floorboards. All of it. Silas was Caleb's older brother by 14 years, and he had never approved of Clara. He had never said so directly. That wasn't how Silas operated. He worked through documents and attorneys and whispered conversations with magistrates. He had taken everything by the time Clara understood what was happening, and by then she had a 5-year-old who had stopped speaking, and a baby growing inside her, and nowhere to go. She ran. She took the children and what she could carry, and she ran, and for 11 weeks she had been running from settlement to settlement while Silas's reach caught up with her. Each time she thought she was safe. It was not dramatic, the chasing. That was the thing nobody would have understood from the outside. It was paperwork. It was a man arriving at a boarding house door with a document. It was a local magistrate who owed Silas a favor, suddenly finding cause to hold her. It was debts she didn't know she had appearing from nowhere and attaching themselves to everything she touched. Frost Hollow was the end of the line. She had known it when she arrived. The mountains closed off the north. The nearest town of any size was 3 days' ride east. She had 31 cents and a broken coat button and children who were hungry in the specific way that children get hungry when they have been hungry too many times in a row, quietly without asking, because they had learned that asking didn't help. Pruitt finished reading the list of debts and looked up. "We'll begin at $2, he said, and Silas Whitmore raised 2 fingers from across the yard. He was standing apart from the crowd, which was his habit. Silas never stood among people if he could position himself above or beside them. He was wearing a good coat. He had a large silver watch chain across his vest that he touched occasionally in the way that powerful men touch expensive things to remind themselves and everyone else of exactly what they are. He was 61 years old and had the look of a man who had spent 6 decades getting everything he wanted and found the process mildly entertaining rather than satisfying. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at Owen. Owen was still standing there with his fists raised, and Silas was watching the boy. With an expression that Clara could only describe as assessment, the way a man looks at a horse, to determine whether it will be useful or difficult. Silas had no children of his own and had never expressed any desire for them, but he had very strong opinions about how children should behave, which was silently and at a distance. No one else raised a hand. Clara felt the reality of it settle over her with a terrible physical weight. She had known this was coming. She had told herself she was prepared. She was not prepared. There is no preparing for the moment when you understand that your children are going to belong to the man who has been hunting you. Owen's hands were shaking. She could see it from where she stood. His fists were still raised, but his hands were shaking badly, and he was blinking in a way that meant he was very close to crying and was working very hard not to. And Clara thought, I have to do something. I have to say something. I cannot let him stand there alone. $3. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Nobody in Frost Hollow recognized it. That was the first thing Clara noticed, the way the crowd shifted. Not toward the sound, but uncertain, recalibrating, because the voice didn't belong to anyone they knew. It was flat and unhurried and carried in the way that voices carry when the person speaking them has spent a long time outdoors and learned to project across distance without raising their pitch. People turned. The man standing at the edge of the yard was tall in a way that was more about bearing than actual height, though he was tall enough. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent years at altitude, skin pulled tight by cold and suns until the bones underneath were visible. His coat was old but well maintained. He was not wearing a hat, which was unusual for the weather, and his dark hair had enough gray in it to suggest somewhere past 40 without being precise about it. He was not looking at Silas. He was looking at Owen. Clara saw it happen. She saw the exact moment Owen registered the newcomer, and the fists came down half an inch. Not all the way, but half an inch. As if something in the man's gaze had communicated without words, that the boy didn't need to hold the whole world back by himself just yet. "We have $3, Pruitt said, in the tone of a man who has suddenly become very interested in whether his shoes are properly laced. Silas turned his head toward the back of the crowd. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it shifted. "4, Silas said. "5, the stranger said immediately. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed his expression. Said it the way you'd say the weather. Silas's jaw tightened. This was not something that happened often in Frost Hollow or anywhere else, someone bidding against Silas Whitmore in a matter that Silas considered already decided. The men nearest to Silas took a half step back, without appearing to notice they'd done it. 10, Silas said. His voice had gone flat. The yard was very quiet. Clara could hear Ben breathing behind her. She could feel Lucy's weight against her side. She was watching the stranger, and she was trying to understand what she was seeing, because nothing about this made sense. Strangers did not walk into Frost Hollow and bid against Silas Whitmore. Strangers, its windows were dark. Strangers who bid against Silas Whitmore did not their hands in their coat cap pockets and their face completely still, as if they were waiting for something that was going to take as long as it took. 14, the stranger said, and then he looked directly at Silas for the first time. Whatever passed between them in that moment, Clara could not name it. She only knew that Silas Whit She only knew that Tarot had walked through 11 weeks of her life like a force of weather, took one look at the stranger's face and did not raise his hand again. Pruitt brought the hammer down so fast it seemed like he wanted to get out of the way of whatever came next. Sold, $14. Nobody clapped, nobody spoke. Crowds separated around the stranger, the way water separates around something that has been dropped into it quickly, instinctively, without discussion. He walked toward the platform. Clara tightened her hand on top of Lucy's head. Owen had turned around to look at her, and his expression was asking a question she didn't have an answer to. Ben had both hands in his pockets and his chin up, which was his version of courage, and she loved him so much in that moment it physically hurt. The stranger stopped at the base of the platform steps. He was not as frightening, up close, as he had appeared from a distance, which Clara immediately mistrusted because nothing about this situation suggested that close proximity was making things safer. He had dark eyes and a scar along his jaw that had healed unevenly and hands that were calloused in the specific places that came from rope work and reins. He did not introduce himself. He did not extend his hand. He looked at Clara for a long moment with an expression that she could not read, not cold exactly, but contained like a fire burning low behind glass, and then he said, simply and quietly, "My name is Ronan Mercer. I have a ranch north of the ridge. My wagon's out front." A pause. "Where we're going, nobody gets to sell your family again." Clara stared at him. Owen made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something harder to name. And Clara, who had not cried in 11 weeks, because crying required privacy she didn't and energy she couldn't spare, felt something loosen behind her eyes that she was not prepared for. She didn't cry, but it was close. "Why?" she asked. He looked at Owen for a moment, then back at her. "The boy was going to fight every one of those men by himself," Ronan said. Seemed like somebody ought to stand with him. It was not a romantic answer. It was not a speech. It was not the kind of thing a person says when they are performing heroism for an audience. It was dark. It was the kind of thing a person says when they mean it so plainly that they haven't thought about how it sounds. Clara looked at her son. Owen was looking at Ronan with an expression she had never seen on her son's face before. Not trust, not exactly, because Owen had learned very specifically not to trust strange men, but something adjacent to it. Something like recognition. Like when you hear a word for a thing you've known your whole life, but never had a name for. "My children come with me," Clara said. "All of them. Condition." "I know," Ronan said, "and I don't—" She stopped. There was a version of this sentence she had rehearsed in her head for situations like this, practical and clear-eyed, about what men typically expected. But standing here with her hand on Lucy's head and Owen's fists, finally down at his sides, and Ben watching her with absolute faith, she could not make herself say, the careful, diplomatic version. "I don't belong to anyone," she said instead. "That doesn't change because of a hammer and $14. Ronan met her eyes. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." Then he turned and walked toward the street, without looking back to see if they were following, which Clara understood immediately was intentional, that he was giving her the choice, openly and without pressure, in front of everyone still watching. Owen looked at her. She looked at her children, Ben with his chin up, Lucy with her face turned slightly away, the baby moving quietly inside her, and she looked at the yard where Silas Whitmore had lowered his silver watch chain and was speaking quietly to one of his men, and she understood with the clarity that comes at the end of running that the only direction left was forward. "Come on," she said. Owen picked up the bag. Ben reached up and took Lucy's hand, and Clara Whitmore, 6 months pregnant, 31 cents to her name, walked off that platform and followed a stranger into the unknown, because the alternative was going back to a man who had already decided that her worth was whatever the market would bear. Behind her, she heard Silas's voice, low and controlled, saying something to his man that she couldn't make out. She didn't turn around. She had spent 11 weeks looking over her shoulder. For the first time, she kept her eyes forward. The wagon was where Ronan had said it would be. He was checking the harness when they arrived, not watching for them, not positioned in a way that suggested he had any doubt they'd come. He helped each child up without ceremony, offered a hand, didn't comment when Ben grabbed it enthusiastically or when Owen climbed up without taking it at all. When he helped Clara up, his grip was firm and brief and completely impersonal, and she found that she was ungrateful for the impersonality in a way she could not have explained. They drove north out of Frost Hollow without speaking. For the first hour, Clara watched the town disappear behind them and waited for the other shoe, for the question she'd have to answer, or the condition she'd missed in the fine print. She had learned in 11 weeks that kindness from strangers was never actually free, and she kept that knowledge in front of her like a lamp in the dark, ready to illuminate whatever was coming. But nothing came. Ronan drove. The children sat in the back. Ben had fallen asleep with his head on Owen's shoulder within 20 minutes, which was so utterly characteristic of him that Clara almost laughed. Lucy was watching the landscape move past with those quiet eyes that saw everything and expressed nothing, and Owen was watching Ronan's back with the focused wariness of a boy who had appointed himself the family's last line of defense and was not ready to stand down just yet. After a long silence, Owen said, "You going to tell us what you want?" Ronan didn't turn around. "Wood split," he said, "stalls cleaned. Fences that need mending from October." Another pause. "Can you work?" Owen straightened slightly, which Clara knew meant the question had landed in exactly the right place. "I can work," Owen said. "Good," Ronan said, and said nothing else. Clara watched her son's shoulders drop half an inch, just half an inch, and understood that some part of the terrible weight Owen had been carrying had shifted, not because the danger was gone, because it wasn't. Silas was still out there, and they all knew it, but because someone had offered Owen something to do with his hands and called it an equal exchange rather than charity. The ridge appeared in the late afternoon. The ranch beyond it was not beautiful. Exactly, it was functional, which in Clara's experience was more honest than beautiful anyway. Solid fences. A barn that had been repaired recently and carefully. A house that was plain built, but appeared to have been built with the intention of lasting, was a specific kind of craftsmanship she had learned to recognize and respect. Ronan pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. "House has 4 rooms," he said, still not turning around. "You'll take the bedroom. I sleep in the loft." "That's your room," Clara said. "It was," he agreed. "Now it's yours." He climbed down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses without any additional commentary, as if the matter was simply settled and he'd moved on to the next thing that needed doing. Owen looked at Clara. Clara looked at the house. Inside her, the baby shifted and settled, the way babies do when they've decided that, wherever they are, it's acceptable for now. She climbed down from the wagon. Her boots hit the ground at Ironwood Ranch, and something in her chest that had been locked and rigid for 11 weeks shifted just slightly. Not open yet, not even close to open, but the first hairline crack of something she hadn't dared name since the quarry. Behind her, she could hear Owen gathering their bag from the wagon, and Ben waking up, disoriented, and asking in his groggy, half-asleep voice where they were, and somewhere far back down the road toward Frost Hollow, Silas Whitmore deciding with cold certainty that this was far from over. Clara walked toward the house. She did not know yet what this man wanted. She did not know if he could be trusted. She did not know what morning would bring or how long the ridge could actually keep Silas out. What she knew was this: her children were indoors and fed for the first night in longer than she wanted to count, and nobody was selling anything tonight. For now, that was enough. For now, that would have to be everything. The first night at Ironwood Ranch, nobody slept well. Clara lay in Ronan's bedroom, his former bedroom. She kept reminding herself, because the distinction felt important, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, and listened to the house settle around her. Old wood contracting in the cold. Wind coming off the ridge with a low, insistent sound like something breathing. Ben had curled against her left side sometime around midnight, finding her in sleep the way he always did, like a compass needle swinging north. Lucy was on her right, so still she barely seemed to breathe at all, which was its own kind of worry that Clara carried separately from all the other worries. Owen had refused the bedroom. He had taken his blanket to the main room and made himself a bed near the door, and when Clara had started to say something about it, he had given her a look that was so precisely his father's look, that particular combination of stubbornness and quiet dignity, that she had closed her mouth and let him be. The boy needed to feel useful. He needed to feel like he was doing something with the fear rather than just sitting inside it. Clara understood that better than she wanted to. She didn't hear Ronan move above her in the loft. She didn't know if he was sleeping either. What she knew was that by the time thin gray light came through the window, she had made a list in her head of every possible way this arrangement could go wrong. And the list was long enough that when Ben woke up and immediately asked if there was food, the practical question came as something like relief. There was food. That was the first surprise. Not lavish food, not anything that required comment, but when Clara came into the main room, she found that someone had already started a fire and left a covered pot on the hook over it. Cornmeal porridge, plain and hot, enough for all of them. Ronan was nowhere inside the house. Through the window she could see him in the yard, working at something near the fence line, his back to the house, apparently uninterested in being thanked. Ben ate 2 bowls and would have attempted a third if Owen hadn't intercepted him. Lucy sat at the table and held her spoon but didn't eat, which was not new. Since the quarry, Lucy had done everything on a slight delay, as if the signal from the world had to travel farther to reach her than it reached everyone else. Clara put a hand on her daughter's back and left it there. And after a few minutes, Lucy picked up the spoon again on her own. Owen ate standing up, near the window, watching Ronan work. He fixed the gate latch, Owen said after a while. Clara looked at him when? Before light, I think. It was loose last night when we came in. This morning it's not. Clara absorbed this without responding. She had learned in the last few months to be careful about assigning meaning to small kindnesses because small kindnesses were sometimes the opening move in something much larger and much less kind. But she stored the information away. The first full day at Ironwood Ranch established a shape that Clara had not expected. Ronan did not give her a list of rules. He did not sit her down and explain how things worked, or what he expected, or what the boundaries were. He seemed to operate on the assumption that she was a grown woman, capable of determining what needed to be done and doing it, which was such a radical departure from the previous 4 months that she spent most of that first morning, slightly off balance, waiting for a correction that didn't come. He did talk to Owen, not extensively, not in long speeches. Most of its windows were dark. But sometime around mid-morning, Clara looked out the window and saw Ronan standing near the barn with Owen beside him, and Ronan appeared to be explaining something about the way the fence posts had been set, gesturing at the ground, then at the wood, then back at the ground, and Owen was listening with his arms crossed and his chin slightly down, which was his version of paying close attention. He asked something. Ronan answered. Owen nodded, picked up a post-hole digger that was nearly as tall as he was, and started working. Clara watched them for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she went back inside to check on Lucy. Ben had discovered the horses. This was perhaps inevitable, given that Ben's primary mode of interacting with the world was like the largest and most potentially dangerous thing in any given environment, and walked directly toward it with his hands out. By afternoon, he was perched on the top rail of the paddock fence, talking to a gray mare named according to Ronan, who had appeared behind Clara at the paddock gate with the uncanny silence she was beginning to recognize as simply how he moved Temperance. She bite? Ben asked. Not yet, Ronan said. Ben considered this. What made her stop? She got older, Ronan said. Settled down. Ben nodded thoughtfully, as if this was information he planned to apply to his own life eventually. Clara felt something shift in her chest that wasn't quite comfortable and wasn't quite the opposite. She filed it away with the gate latch and the porridge and kept moving. Lucy remained the problem that Clara didn't know how to solve. Not a problem in the way that problems have solutions. Lucy wasn't broken. She wasn't wrong. She was simply a 5-year-old girl who had watched her father fall into a hole in the earth and not come back out. And she had decided, somewhere in the hours that followed, that words were something she could live without. Doctors in 2 different towns had told Clara this was not permanent, probably that children came back from these things, usually in their own time. Clara had noticed the way those doctors qualified every single thing they said and had understood that nobody actually knew. She had tried reading to Lucy, singing to her, giving her small tasks that required responses. Lucy would comply with anything asked of her, but would not initiate anything herself, and she would not speak. She watched, she observed everything with those wide, careful eyes that reminded Clara so sharply of Caleb that it sometimes physically hurt to look at her. On the 3rd day, Ronan sat down on the floor. Clara noticed this because Ronan did not typically sit unless he was eating or had a specific reason to stop moving, and he was sitting in the main room near where Lucy had positioned herself in the corner by the window, her preferred spot, from which she could watch both the room and the yard simultaneously. He sat cross-legged on the floor about 6 feet from her, and he had a piece of leather in his hands and a small tool. He didn't speak to Lucy. He didn't look at her. He just started working the leather, punching small holes along the edge in a regular pattern with the focus of a man doing something he has done 10,000 times and still finds worth doing carefully. The sound was quiet and rhythmic. Punch, shift, punch, shift. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched, not sure what she was watching. After about 10 minutes, Lucy turned her head and looked at Ronan's hands. He kept working. After another 5 minutes, Lucy stood up slowly, cautiously, the way she did everything, and moved 2 feet closer, then stopped. Watching his hands, Ronan reached beside him without looking up and put a second piece of scrap leather on the floor between them, set a small tool next to it, then went back to his own work. Lucy looked at the leather, looked at Ronan, looked at the leather again. She sat back down. She picked up the scrap leather. She looked at the tool for a long time. Ronan, without turning his head, angled his own piece slightly so she could see what he was doing. Clara pressed her fingers over her mouth and went back into the kitchen before either of them could see her face. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself not to read into it. She had learned in 11 weeks that hope was the most dangerous thing she could carry because hope was heavy and it slowed you down when you needed to be fast. But that night, for the first time in 4 months, Lucy ate her whole dinner. The days found their rhythm before Clara had consciously agreed to let them. She cooked if its windows were dark, cooked because she was good at it, and because feeding people was something useful she could do without requiring anything from anyone. Kept the house. She mended what needed mending. She was not a woman who sat easily. Never been, Caleb used to say. She approached stillness like it was something that had to be earned, and Ironwood Ranch offered enough that needed doing that she could stay useful and keep the thinking manageable. Owen worked beside Ronan every day. He was still watchful. He still positioned himself between the adults and his siblings with a regularity that Clara recognized as habits so deep it had become instinct. But he was working, and the work was real work, and Ronan treated it as real, not performance, not charity, but actual labor that actually mattered. At dinner, Owen would sometimes report things with the slightly competitive edge of a boy who wanted to be noticed without asking to be noticed, the post he'd set straight that had been leaning 2 inches, the stall he'd cleaned faster than expected. Ronan would listen and nod, and sometimes say something technical in return about angle or depth or the particular way frozen ground behaved differently than thawed ground, and Owen would absorb it with the seriousness of someone receiving important information. Clara watched this happen over the course of a week and understood that her son was doing something she hadn't been able to give him, learning how to be a man from a man who hadn't yet given him a reason not to trust the lesson. It was on the 9th day that everything shifted again. The sound of a horse in the yard at midday was not unusual, but Ronan came through the door with a different quality to his movement than Clara had seen before, not rushed, but altered, the way a person moves when they've already made a series of calculations and are now executing them. "Stay inside," he said, and looked directly at Clara. "What is it?" "Deputy from Harlan County. He's alone a beat. Silas sent him." Owen was on his feet before Clara could speak. Ronan pointed at him without breaking stride to the door. "Stay with your mother." But not a request. Owen's jaw tightened. He stayed. Clara moved to the window and watched Ronan walk out to meet the rider, who had stopped in the middle of the yard and was sitting his horse with the self-consciousness of a man who had been sent to do something he's not certain is a good idea. He was young. Younger than Clara had expected. He had a deputy's badge that caught the light and a letter in his hand that he held out to Ronan from the saddle, apparently unwilling to dismount. Ronan took the letter, read it, folded it. The conversation from here Clara couldn't hear, but she could read it in posture and pace. The deputy talked for a while. Ronan didn't move. The deputy talked some more. Ronan said something brief. The deputy shifted in his saddle. Ronan said something else, equally brief. The deputy looked at. The house looked directly at the window where Clara was standing, which made her resist the urge to step back, and then looked back at Ronan and then turned his horse around and rode back down the track toward the main road. Ronan came back inside. He put the letter on the table and smoothed it flat with one hand. Silas has filed a petition, he said. He's claiming guardianship over the children on the grounds of family precedence. He's arguing that as Caleb's surviving older male relative, the children belong under his authority. Clara felt the cold settle into her stomach. He can do that? He thinks he can. Ronan looked at the letter. He's done it before, apparently. Other family. The deputy didn't say it in those words, but that's what he was telling me. What does the letter say? That you have 30 days to respond through a territorial magistrate, or the petition is granted by default. Owen made a sound. There's something else, Ronan said. He looked up from the letter, and his eyes moved to Clara's face in the careful way she had come to recognize the way. He looked at things he considered important. The deputy said something off the record. He said if you were part of an established household, legally, established Silas's petition would need a different kind of standing. Family precedence only applies when there's no existing household authority. The room was very quiet. Ben had appeared in the doorway from the bedroom without anyone noticing, as Ben frequently appeared places without anyone noticing. He was looking between Clara and Ronan with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is happening even if the specific words are above him. Lucy was in her corner. She was holding the scrap of leather. She wasn't punching holes in it. Today she was just holding it, the way she held things that had become important to her. Clara looked at Ronan. Are you asking me something? She said. No, he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it exactly. I'm telling you what the deputy told me. What you do with it is your decision. There are other ways to fight this. There are, he agreed. Slower ones. Less certain. He paused. I won't tell you what to choose. Clara turned and looked at her children. Owen was standing against the wall, his arms crossed and his face as carefully neutral in the specific way he went neutral when he was feeling something he didn't think he was allowed to feel. Ben was watching her with complete trust, which was almost harder than the neutral face. Lucy had her eyes down on the leather. She thought about Caleb. Not about him dying. She thought about him dying all the time and had learned to carry that in a particular way, but about who he had been. Caleb would have hated this situation with a passion and found it deeply funny in the dark, specific way. He found awful things funny, and he would have said something that made her laugh at a completely inappropriate moment, and then he would have said, do what keeps them safe, Clara. Everything else figures itself out. She looked at Ronan. If I say yes, she said, I need you to understand something first. All right, this would be a legal arrangement. For the children's protection. I'm not asking you for anything beyond what you've already given us. A roof and time. You don't owe me anything more than that, and I don't owe you more than that. Something moved across Ronan's face that she couldn't completely read. Not offense, exactly. Not agreement, exactly, either. I understand what you're saying, he said, and I'm not going to argue with any of it. I need to hear you say that you understand what this isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then it isn't a promise of something it isn't. I know that. Clara nodded once. Then yes, she said. Owen made another sound. This one was different. Clara looked at him and found her son staring at the ceiling with his jaw working and his eyes bright in the way eyes get bright when a person is refusing to let them do what they want to do. Owen, she said. I know, he said, still looking at the ceiling. I know it makes sense. It does. I know. He lowered his head and looked at her, and his face was so open and so young in that moment, not the careful, watchful face she'd been seeing for months, but the actual face underneath it. The 11-year-old face that she had to look away for a moment. Dad's only been gone 4 months. The room sat with that. Ronan said nothing, which was, Clara thought, exactly right. Your father, Clara said carefully, would want you safe. He would want Lucy to be safe, and Ben to be safe, and the baby to be safe. This is how we make that happen right now. It doesn't change who your father was. Owen nodded, looked at the floor. Okay, he said. The marriage was recorded in Red Willow County 8 days later. They rode into town on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the temperature had dropped overnight to something that made your breath come out in clouds. The magistrate's office was a small room that smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and the magistrate himself was a man named Garrett, who had the look of someone who had seen enough in his years to have stopped being surprised by anything, and was now simply trying to get through the afternoon. He read the relevant document, asked the relevant questions, wrote the relevant things in the relevant book. It took 12 minutes. Ronan signed, Clara signed, Garrett signed. There was no ceremony beyond what the law required. No celebration, no dinner afterward, no acknowledgement that anything had happened beyond the practical thing that had happened. They rode back to Ironwood Ranch in the same quiet they'd ridden out in, and when they arrived, Ronan unhitched the horse and went back to work, and Clara went inside and made supper, and Owen set the table without being asked. But something had changed. Clara couldn't have said exactly what it was. The house was the same. The people in it were the same. The situation was the same. Silas was still out there. The petition was still filed. The danger was still real. But there was something different about being inside a thing and having it named, even if the naming was purely legal and purely functional, and involved none of the feelings that naming was supposed to involve. She was Clara Mercer now, in the eyes of Red Willow County. Most of its windows were dark. She stood at the kitchen window that evening and looked at the ridge and thought about what that meant, and what it didn't mean, and what she was going to do with the part of herself that had noticed. In the magistrate's office, that Ronan's hand had been steady when he signed, and that steadiness had mattered to her more than she wanted it to, not because of what it suggested, because of what it didn't. She had been around men who performed steadiness, who used calm as a tool the same way other men used volume. Caleb hadn't been steady, actually. Caleb had been warm and quick, and sometimes too loud and occasionally wrong in ways he was terrible at admitting. She had loved him for all of it. Ronan was something different. Ronan was steady in the way that a thing is steady when it has been tested enough times that unsteady parts have already broken off, and what remains is what remains. She didn't know what had broken off. She didn't know the story behind the scar on his jaw, or why he lived alone on a ridge, or what he'd left behind when he stopped tracking and came north. She was aware that she didn't know, which was a different thing from not caring. But she had children to keep alive, and a baby coming in 3 months, and those facts sat at the front of everything else. She was still standing at the window when Ronan came in to wash up before supper. He stopped when he saw her expression or something. In her posture, she didn't know which. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a second longer than necessary, then went to the basin. Silas's men were at the Ridge Road today, he said, his back to her, washing his hands. 2 of them, just watching. Clara felt the cold in her stomach again. "They didn't come down," Ronan continued. "They were checking where we were, making sure we were still here. That means he knows. He knew before the wedding. He has someone in town." Ronan dried his hands, turned around. "He'll make a move soon. I want you to know that without being surprised by it. I'm not fragile," Clara said. "I know you're not," he said. And the uncomplicated directness of it caught her slightly off guard because most men who said it, in the middle of softening something or at the beginning of something they thought needed to be softened, and Ronan said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather. "How soon?" she asked. "Days, maybe a week." He set the towel down. "I've been thinking about who I can reach. I have men I've worked with. Men who owe me." He said this last part carefully, like he was choosing the words. "I don't like asking, but I may need to ask." This was the most he had said at once in the 2 weeks she had known him, and Clara recognized it for what it was, not a speech, but a disclosure. The specific kind of disclosure a private person makes when they have decided to let someone know what they're carrying. "Then ask," she said. "My children are worth more than your reluctance to ask." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent. "Yes," he said, "they are." Supper that night was the 4 of them and Ronan around the table, which had become the evening's shape without anyone deciding it. Owen reported that he'd finally gotten the southeast fence post to stop leaning. Ben had apparently convinced Temperance to eat from his hand, which he described in more detail than the accomplishment strictly required. Clara listened and served and let the ordinary sounds of it settle over her like something she was still learning to trust. Then Lucy reached across the table and put her scrap of leather, the piece she'd been carrying for 4 days, in front of Ronan's plate. Everyone went quiet. Ronan looked at it, then at Lucy. Lucy had her eyes down and was clearly not going to look up, and the tips of her ears had gone pink. And Clara recognized this combination in her daughter as something she had not seen in 4 months: embarrassment. The specific embarrassment of doing something that mattered to you in front of other people. Ronan picked up the leather piece. It had holes punched around the entire edge, in a pattern that was slightly uneven, but genuinely there, a circuit, complete. He turned it over in his hands. He set it back down in front of himself. Then he took his own piece of leather out of his coat pocket. He apparently carried it with him, which Clara noted next Claire had, and set it next to hers. He hadn't said anything. Lucy looked up finally in a quick glance. Ronan looked at her leather and then at his, as if he was comparing them seriously, as if this was a professional evaluation. Yours is steadier on the bottom half, he said. Lucy looked at the pieces, back at him. Her mouth did something complicated. Then she looked back down, but the tips of her ears were still pink. But Clara picked up her fork and said, "'Tis nothing," and ate her supper and did not look at anyone for a moment because she needed the moment to get herself back. 6 days later, Silas made his move. It came not in the form of men on horses, which was what Clara had been unconsciously preparing for. It came in the form of 3 riders who appeared at the main road gate in the late morning, while Ronan was up the ridge checking a fence line with Owen, and Clara was alone in the yard with Ben and Lucy. She heard the horses first. She recognized one of the men. He had come to her door twice before in the weeks before Frost Hollow. He worked for Silas not as a hired gun, but as something more specific, a man who delivered messages and waited for compliance, the administrative edge of Silas's power. He sat his horse with the patience of someone who was very comfortable with the idea of waiting as long as necessary. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mercer," Clara said. He smiled the way people smile when they consider something technically true, but fundamentally irrelevant. "Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you. He's prepared to be reasonable." "He's prepared," Clara said. "That's a word. He wants the children settled properly. He has resources. He has family standing." The man looked at the house and let his gaze move over it in a way that communicated clearly what he thought of Ironwood Ranch relative to Silas Whitmore's resources. "Whatever arrangement you've made here isn't going to hold against a territorial petition. You must know that." "I know Silas sent 3 men to talk to 1 woman," Clara said. "I know what that suggests about who he's afraid of." The man's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "1 week," he said. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be generous. Come back with a territorial judge and a legal writ," Clara said. "Don't come back with anything less." She turned and walked back to the house, her hands loose at her sides, her back completely straight. She did not run. She did not lock the door loudly. She simply went inside and stood with her back against the wall beside the window, and listened to the sound of 3 horses eventually moving away. And her heart was hammering so hard, she was certain Ben could hear it from across the room. Ben was looking at her. "Were those bad men?" he said. "Yes," Clara said, because he was 7, and he deserved a straight answer. "Are you scared?" She thought about Caleb. She thought about the auction platform. She thought about Owen's fists and Lucy's leather piece and 12 minutes in a magistrate's office and a man who said, "I know, you're not like it was a simple fact." "A little," she said. "That's all right." Ben considered this. "Ronan won't like that they came," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "He won't." She was right. When Ronan came back down from the ridge with Owen and she told him, his face went through a rapid, quiet process she had come to associate with him, making decisions not deliberation exactly, more like a series of very fast private confirmations. "They came to the yard while I was gone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, they spoke to you directly." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was deliberate. He sent them when I was away." "I know," Clara said. "I figured that out." Owen had come in behind Ronan and was listening with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the controlled thing. "What do we do?" Owen said. Ronan looked at Clara. The look was different this time from the careful looks he'd given her in the first weeks. This one was not asking for permission exactly, but checking. Checking that she was with him on what came next, that they were facing the same direction. Clara nodded. "I send word to 6 men tonight," Ronan said. "And tomorrow we start on the root cellar." "What's the root cellar for?" Ben asked from the doorway. "Storing things," Ronan said. Clara looked at him. He looked back. They both knew it wasn't for storing things. That night, after the children were down, Clara sat at the table with the lamp turned low, and Ronan sat across from her with paper and a pen, writing 6 different letters to 6 different men in a handwriting that was small and precise. She watched him write and thought about all the things she still didn't know about him. The years before the ranch. The dangerous men he'd tracked. The family she'd heard mentioned in town whispers and hadn't asked about. She had asked him once, obliquely, why he'd left tracking. He had been quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he'd said, got tired of arriving after. She hadn't asked anything else. Now, watching him write, she understood that this man had spent years arriving, after things had already gone wrong, and had found his way to a ridge in the mountains where he didn't have to arrive after anything, because nothing was happening. And then a pregnant woman and 3 children had appeared in Frost Hollow. And he had made a decision in the span of a single auction, and now things were happening again. And his handwriting was still small and precise, and his hands were still steady. Ronan, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. Just that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the paper. You don't need to thank me, he said. I know I don't need to, she said. I wanted to. He didn't answer, but she saw his pen stop moving for just a second before it started again. Outside, the wind came off the ridge with its low breathing sound, and somewhere down the road, Silas Whitmore was planning the next move in a game he believed he had already won. And inside Ironwood Ranch, a woman who had been told her worth for 4 months sat across from a man who had paid $14 and never once suggested she owed him anything for it, and the lamp burned between them. Tomorrow would be harder. The day after would be harder still. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, 6 letters were being written in small, steady handwriting, and the fire was holding, and Clara Mercer, the name settled differently than she expected. Not like a constraint, but like a coat that let herself breathe in and out without counting the seconds between. That was something. For right now, that was enough. The 6 letters went out with a writer Ronan trusted, a weathered man named Cobb, who asked no questions and expected none asked of him in return. Most of its windows were dark, and after that there was nothing to do but wait and work and keep the days from collapsing under the weight of what was coming. Waiting was harder than running, Clara discovered. Running had a momentum to it. It used the fear as fuel, burned it up in motion, so there was nothing left over at the end of the day. Waiting left the fear sitting in you untouched, accumulating interest. She managed it by staying useful. She reorganized the kitchen stores and took an honest inventory of what they had versus what they needed. She mended every item of clothing that needed mending, including 2 of Ronan's shirts that had been folded on a shelf for what looked like months with the tears unremarked upon, which she sewed shut without mentioning, because mentioning would have required a conversation about whether she had the right to touch its things, and she didn't want to have that conversation. She started a kitchen garden plan on paper, even though the ground was still frozen, because having a plan for spring meant committing to the idea that they would still be here in spring, which was either foolish optimism or a necessary act of will, and she chose not to examine which. Owen continued working with Ronan, and the scope of that work expanded as the days passed. Ronan taught him to check a rifle, not to shoot it. That would come later, but to check it, to understand its condition and its limitations, in the same way you understood the condition and limitations of a fence post or a horse. Owen absorbed this with the focused gravity he brought to everything that Ronan gave him, and Clara watched her son become something incrementally more than he had been, which was its own complicated feeling because she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for it. Ben broke a fence post the 4th day. He had been attempting to demonstrate to Temperance that he could balance on the rail, while scratching behind her ears with one hand, which was an idea that required comment from nobody, because the outcome was self-evident. Post cracked clean, and Ben went sideways into the snow and sat there looking at the damage with an expression of genuine philosophical surprise, as if the laws of physics had acted in a way he found personally unreasonable. Ronan stood at the paddock gate and looked at the broken post and then at Ben. Ben looked up at him. "I'll fix it," Ben said. "You will," Ronan agreed. He showed Ben how. It took most of the afternoon, and Ben's hands were raw from the cold by the end of it, but the post was in, and Ronan checked it without praise or criticism, just the nod he gave when something was done adequately, and Ben wore that nod for the rest of the evening like it was made of gold. Clara noticed that Ronan never praised the children effusively. He acknowledged work, checked work, corrected what needed correcting, and moved on. It was so different from the performance of male approval she had watched. Her boys received from men who wanted something from the receiving of it that she found herself trying to understand what it meant about him. Either he had no sentiment in him at all, which she no longer believed, or he had learned to express it in a register that she was still learning to read. She suspected the second. She was in the middle of this thinking on the evening of the 6th day since the letters had gone out, when Lucy spoke for the first time. Clara was sitting beside Lucy in the bedroom after supper, their nightly ritual not doing anything specific, just being present, which was what Lucy needed more than anything anyone had tried to do for her. She had Lucy's leather piece in her hands and was running her thumb along the holes Lucy had punched, and she was thinking about Silas and the root cellar Ronan had spent 2 days reinforcing and the sound the ridge wind made at night. And Lucy said, in a voice so quiet it barely qualified as sound, "Mama, the snow is beautiful." Clara stopped breathing. Lucy's were dark. Lucy was looking at the window, where the last gray light was catching the snow on the ridge and making it do something with color that was technically just refraction, but looked like something else entirely. Her expression was simply observational. She was not performing the statement, not testing Clara's reaction, just saying a thing that was true in the way children say things that are true before they learn to be self-conscious about truth. Clara set the leather down very carefully. She put her hand over her mouth. Then she put her arm around Lucy and pulled her daughter against her side and did not make a single sound, but her whole body was shaking in the particular way. Bodies shake when something that has been held in too long finally starts to move. Most of its windows were dark. Lucy tolerated the embrace with the patience of a child who does not entirely understand why the adults are being dramatic, but is willing to allow it for a reasonable duration. After a moment she said, still looking at the window, "It makes the ridge look like it has a hat." Clara laughed. It came out wrong, too wet, more than a laugh. But Lucy didn't seem concerned. "Does," Clara managed. "It looks exactly like a hat." She heard the front door open and close Ronan coming in from the last check of the animals, and she heard
Owen
and Ronan's voice saying something back and forth, and she sat in that bedroom with her daughter for another few minutes before she trusted herself to walk out normally. When she came into the main room, Ronan was at the basin and Owen was at the table with a book, and Ben was already most of the way to sleep in the chair by the fire in the way that 7-year-old boys went horizontal the moment they stopped moving. Ronan glanced at her when she came in. She met his eyes. Something passed between them. She couldn't have described it to anyone. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth. Something more like recognition. He saw something in her face, and he understood, without her saying a word, that something had happened that mattered. Turned back to the basin. "I'll make tea," he said. It was such a plain, ordinary thing to say that Clara felt it hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way that surprised her. She sat at the table, and Owen looked up from his book, and she said, "Lucy talked tonight," and Owen's book came down flat on the table. "What did she say?" he said. "She said the snow was beautiful." Owen looked at the window, his jaw worked. He looked back at his book without looking at it. "That's good," he said, in a voice calibrated for someone who is not going to cry in the main room in front of people, a calibration he did not entirely achieve. "Yeah," Clara said, "it is." Ronan set a cup of tea in front of her and went back to the fire without ceremony, and the four of them sat in the ordinary light of an ordinary evening, and it was not safety exactly, because safety was not something they had yet, but it was something that rhymed with it. The first of Ronan's men arrived 2 days later. He came in at dusk, a broad-shouldered man named Hale, who rode a big brown horse and had an injury to his left hand that had healed into a permanent half-curl, which he managed with the casual adaptation of someone who had made peace with what was permanent long ago. He greeted Ronan with a handshake and a short sentence Clara couldn't hear from the window, and Ronan brought him inside and introduced him simply by name. Most of its windows were dark. Hale took off his hat when he came in, the way a man looks at children when he has not been around them in a long time and has temporarily forgotten the protocol. Ben filled the silence by asking immediately if he could see the horse. "Tomorrow," Clara said. "He won't bite," Hale offered. "That's not the concern," Clara said, and Hale smiled for the first time, which made him look younger and less formidable, which she suspected was the point. The other men came over the following 3 days in 1s and 2s, and Ironwood Ranch shifted under the weight of the addition. These were not young men. They were men shaped by years in outdoor conditions weather-worn, in ways that were specific and asymmetrical, scarred in ways that had stories Clara didn't ask about. They were men who clearly knew each other through Ronan, through some shared history that had its own language, its own shorthand. They were also, without exception, careful with the children. Not performatively careful, not the strained politeness of men who find children inconvenient, but are aware they're supposed to pretend otherwise. More like the care of men who understood that the children were the point, were the center of whatever this was, and behaved accordingly. One of them, a thin, quiet man named Dix, spent an entire afternoon teaching Owen how to play a card game that appeared to have 100 rules and no clear winning condition, and was patient about it in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Claire observed all of this from the edges and thought about what it meant that Ronan could call six in from wherever they'd been and they would come. She asked him about it one evening when the others were in the barn and the children were down. "Hale," she said, "how do you know him?" Ronan was cleaning a rifle at the table. He didn't look up. He was pinned under a canyon wall in the territory about 8 years back. I pulled him out. "Just you? Just me?" Clara looked at the rifle. "And the others?" "Different things." He set the cloth down. "Some of them, I was the person who showed up. When nobody else did." He paused. "I used to think that was just the job. Showing up. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I think it matters who shows up." She held that for a moment. "Ronan, what happened to your family?" The question came out before she finished deciding to ask it. She saw it land not like a blow, but like something that found a specific place it knew to go. He was quiet long enough that she started to apologize. "Wife," he said, "2 children. Long time ago." He picked up the cloth again but didn't use it. "Fever. Both children first, then her. Inside of 2 weeks. I was tracking a man 300 miles north, and by the time the message reached me, it was already over." Clara didn't say anything. "That's why I stopped," he said. "Not because I couldn't do it anymore. Because what it meant to be somewhere else kept getting heavier." He looked at the rifle rather than at her. "I came up here to be somewhere that didn't remind me of anything. And instead we showed up," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile, but it was adjacent. "Instead you showed up," he said. "The morning, everything changed. Started with snow. Not a storm exactly, a steady series of snowfall that had been dropping since before dawn and showed no particular intention of stopping. The ridge disappeared into it. The yard was 3 inches deep by the time anyone was awake, and the silence it created was the particular pressed-down quiet of a world that has been muffled, where sound travels differently and distance becomes unreliable. Claire was making breakfast when she heard a sound she didn't immediately identify. She stood still with the skillet in her hand and listened. Owen was the first one to the window. "Ronan," he said, in a voice stripped of everything except the essential information. Ronan was across the room and at the window in 4 steps. Outside, beyond the yard fence, there was orange. It was the barn. The far end of it, the part that abutted the storage lean-to, had caught not the way things catch from an accident, gradually, with the specific accidental quality of a knocked-over lantern. This was deliberate. This was multiple points of origin burning simultaneously in the way that only happens when someone has made sure. Ronan was through the door before Clara could say a word. She heard him shouting his voice, calling to the men in the bunkhouse, which Hale and 2 others had been using, and then heard other voices and running footsteps through the snow, and she stood in the kitchen for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself move. "Owen," she said, "take Ben and Lucy downstairs. Root cellar." "Mom now." Owen went. He grabbed Ben, who was disoriented and still half asleep, and asking what was burning, and he grabbed Lucy's hand, and he moved. Whatever had been unsteady in Owen in the first weeks at Ironwood Ranch had been replaced by something that functioned like a mechanism when mechanisms were required, and Clara saw it click into place as she watched him get the children through the house. She grabbed her coat and went outside. The barn was burning properly, now the far end was fully involved, and the fire had gotten into the roof and was doing what fire does in old wood, which is move faster than anyone expects. The horses were screaming. Clara could hear them above everything else. That specific register of horse, fear that bypasses the thinking part of the brain and goes somewhere much older. Ronan was at the barn doors. He and Hale had the big doors open and were inside, and Clara could see the shapes of them moving in the smoke, and then a horse came through Temperance, wild-eyed and sideways and then another, and Dix was at the fence line catching halters while the horses tried to go in 4 directions. Then the section of roof above the far doors came down. Clara didn't see exactly what happened. She heard it a sound like the world rearranging itself, followed by a cascade of sparks that rose and spread and began coming down in the snow. Then she heard the men shouting differently, not organizationally, but in the specific way people shout when something has gone wrong with a person. She was running before she knew she was running. Hale and one of the other men were pulling something out of the barn doorway. A shape. Ronan's coat was on fire along the left shoulder, and Hale was beating it out with his bare hands, and Ronan was conscious but moving wrong, one arm not tracking with the rest of him, and when Clara reached them, he was trying to tell Hale something about the horses, and Hale was trying to hear him, and also trying to stop the bleeding that was coming from somewhere along Ronan's left side. "Ronan," Clara said. He looked at her. His eyes were focused and present, which she used as information. "Horses out?" he said. "Dix has them," Hale said. "Stop talking about the horses." "How bad?" Ronan said to Clara directly, because Hale was obviously going to manage the information, and Ronan had apparently identified Clara as someone who would give him a straight answer. She looked at the shoulder and the side. "You need to get inside." "That's not what I asked." "I know," she said. "Get inside anyway." He did, which told her something about how much it was hurting, because Ronan did not comply with directives easily, when he didn't think they were necessary. Inside the house, Owen had appeared at the top of the root cellar stairs the moment he heard adult footsteps, which Clara dealt with by meeting his eyes and saying, "He's hurt, but he's walking," and Owen relayed this information downstairs in a tone so careful and controlled that it hurt her to hear it. She got Ronan's coat off, which required patience and a level of swearing on Ronan's part that she had not previously heard from him and did not comment on. The shoulder was burned, not the worst she'd seen, but serious enough. The side was a gash from something in the falling debris, long but not deep. She cleaned both with what she had and bound what needed binding, and Ronan sat on the kitchen chair with the specific stillness of a man enduring something by removing himself slightly from it. Hale came in while she was working. "The barn's gone," he said. "The lean-to's gone. We saved the house fence and the horses are in the west paddock." Ronan said something short. "There's more," Hale said. He looked at Clara, then back at Ronan. "I found tracks at the tree line. Multiple horses. They were watching. How long?" Ronan said. "Couldn't have been there long, or we'd have seen them earlier." Hale pulled off his hat and held it. This wasn't random. This was a message. Clara had been tying off the bandage at Ronan's side. She stopped. "A message that says what?" she said. Neither man answered immediately. "That he can reach us here," Ronan said. "That the ridge isn't the barrier I said it was." Clara sat back and looked at him. Ronan's face was a controlled thing she had learned to read it in the weeks at Ironwood Ranch, to look for the small shifts that indicated what was happening underneath. Right now, what was happening underneath was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear, not anger exactly. Something more like recalculation, a man realizing that the position he thought he held was different from the position he actually held. He had told her she was safe here. He had believed it when he said it. Now the barn was ash, and Silas's men had stood at the tree line and watched it burn, and he was sitting in his kitchen with his shoulder bandaged, and Clara and her children were in the building that had not yet burned only because Silas Whitmore wanted them to understand that he could burn it if he chose to. "We leave," Clara said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "We run again," she said. "That's what he wants. He wants us frightened and running, and eventually we run somewhere. He already has hands, and it ends there." She could hear her own voice doing something unfamiliar, which was steadiness, not the performed steadiness of someone trying to appear calm, but the actual steadiness that comes from having finally identified the shape of the thing you're afraid of and deciding that being. Afraid of it is not the same as being defeated by it. He has done this to other people. Not just me. He has been doing this for years. She stood up from where she'd been kneeling beside Ronan's chair. "I found out things in town," she said. "When we went for the wedding, I talked to women while you were at Garrett's office. A widow named Sable, whose husband Silas pressured off his mine claim. Storekeeper, whose father signed documents under Silas's influence that the father later said he didn't understand. A rancher's wife who said her family left Red Willow County to get away from him. She looked at Hale and then at Ronan. He has been doing this for as long as anyone can remember, and nobody has ever made him account for it, because every time there's one person or one family against him, he wins. We're not one family now, Hale said. 7 isn't enough, Clara said. 7 men is an armed standoff. It ends in violence, and violence helps Silas because he has more men than we have, and because violence can be characterized in the territory documents any way he wants to characterize it. She turned to Ronan, but witnesses can't. Signed statements can't. If every person he has ever done this to gives a statement to the territorial investigators, that is not something he can outbid or outmaneuver. Ronan was watching her. His face had done the thing it did when he was moving through a set of rapid private calculations. You'd have to get those people to sign, he said. Most of them are scared. I know they're scared, Clara said. I know what it feels like to be scared of him. I also know that it's different when you're not alone. She paused. I need 2 days. I need to go back to town. He'll have men watching the town road, Hale said. Not the town road, Ronan said. He was still watching Clara. There's a lower trail. Takes longer, but it comes out on the eastern side of Red Willow. He paused. I'll ride with you. You're injured. I know I'm injured. Ron, I know, he said. I'll ride with you anyway. She wanted to argue. She looked at him, the bandaged shoulder, the careful way he was holding his left side, the absolute quiet certainty in his face, and she recognized that arguing was not going to accomplish anything. Fine, she said. We leave before light. She went to the root cellar stairs and opened the door, and her children came up. Ben first, with sleep still in his eyes, and a question forming. Lucy behind him with her leather piece still in her fist. She had apparently taken it to the cellar with her, which said something, and Owen last. With his face set in the particular way he'd had since the beginning, the way that meant he had already decided he was going to be ready for whatever came next. The barn burned, Clara said, because they needed to know, and because not telling them would be worse. Ben looked at the window. Is Temperance okay? The horses are fine, Hale said from across the room. All of them. Ben sat down with the specific slump of a child, relieved of a specific worry. Lucy looked at Ronan's shoulder. She walked across the room to where he was sitting in the chair slowly, as she did everything but without hesitation, and beside him, and looked at the bandage. Then she reached out and put her hand on his right arm. Just rested it there. Ronan looked at her hand. He didn't say anything. Lucy looked at the window at the dark outside where the snow was still coming down, and the ash of the barn was somewhere beyond it. It's still snowing, she said. And it was the second time she had spoken, and her voice was still small and still careful. But it was there. It was present. And Maltsovitz and Ronan sat very still under her hand, and something moved through his face that had nothing to do with the shoulder or the side. Yeah, he said. It is. Clara stood in her kitchen and looked at the man who had paid $14 for a chance, and the daughter who had decided to speak again on a night when things were burning, and she felt something she had been trying not to feel since the wagon ride up from Frost Hollow. Not love, not yet. That was a word with weight she was not ready to put down or pick up, but something that went in that direction. She filed it away, as she had been filing things. There was no time for it tonight. There was a plan to execute and a town to reach, and statements to collect from frightened people who needed to stop being frightened for long enough to sign their names. She turned to Hale. Wake me at 4, she said. Yes, ma'am. Hale said, and there was nothing in the way he said it of the usual wait men. Put on ma'am, it was flat and sincere, and she registered it. She looked at Owen. He was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms crossed, and his eyes moving between Ronan and Clara with an expression she recognized from the platform in Frost Hollow, that particular look of fierce calculation that meant he was determining what his job was in this specific moment. Owen, she said. He looked at her. You're in charge of Ben and Lucy while we're gone, she said. Not in charge of protecting the house. Not in charge of fighting anyone. In charge of your brother and your sister. That's the whole job. He understood the distinction immediately. She could see it land, see him accept it. Okay, he said. Hale and the others will be here. I know. He pushed off the wall. Mom. She looked at him. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and for a moment he looked so precisely like Caleb that her chest ached with it, the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way he held himself when he was about to say something that cost him something. Don't let anything happen to you, he said. It was so young and so old at the same time, the way his voice went on it. "I won't," she said. It was not a promise she had any certainty of keeping. He knew that. She knew he knew. But she said it anyway, because he needed to hear it, and because sometimes saying a thing is the beginning of making it true. She pulled her son against her. He was stiff for a moment, the way he went stiff when things felt too large, and then he wasn't, and she held him for 3 seconds and then let go. Outside, the snow kept coming down. The barn was ash. The men Ronan had called were awake in the bunkhouse now, quiet and ready, and Silas Whitmore was somewhere down the road in the dark, believing that the fire had done what fires are supposed to do, which is to reduce things to nothing. He was going to discover that some things do not reduce. Clara went to bed at midnight and did not sleep, and at 4 o'clock hail knocked, and she was already dressed. At 4:30, she and Ronan were on horses in the dark, heading east on a trail that wound below the ridge, and the snow had thinned to something that fell without sound. And the cold was the serious kind that went past discomfort into something that required active management. Ronan rode slightly ahead, not leading keeping watch. She had learned the difference. After a while, he said without turning around, "You laid that out well, tonight." The plan. "I've had time to think," she said. "Most people," he said, "when they're frightened, think smaller, not larger." She considered that. "Most people haven't been running for 3 months," she said. "You run long enough, you figure out that smaller isn't working." He was quiet for a while. "Clara," he said. She brought her horse even with his. He kept his eyes on the trail, but his voice was different from usual, the careful quality it got when he was about to say something he had been arranging for a while. "When this is over," he said, "whatever we built to survive this, I don't expect you to keep it if you don't want to." She looked at his profile in the dark. "The arrangement," she said. "Yes. You're telling me there's a door." "I'm telling you there's a door," he confirmed. "I want you to know it's there." She looked at the trail ahead. "Ronan," she said, "when this is over, I'll look at the door." She paused. "I'm not ready to look at it tonight." He nodded once. They rode on through the dark and the thin snow toward Red Willow, and behind them Ironwood Ranch sat in the cold, with 6 men awake and 3 children sleeping. Most of its windows were dark, and ahead of them were frightened people who needed to stop being frightened for long enough to change things. Clara rode with her back straight, and her hands steady on the reins, and the cold on her face. She thought about Silas Whitmore reading about a barn fire in the morning with his zipper chain, and his satisfied expression and believing he had broken something. She thought about what it was going to look like when he discovered he hadn't. She thought about Lucy's hand on Ronan's arm. She thought about Owen saying, "Don't let anything happen to you." Kept her eyes on the trail and kept riding and did not look back, because looking back was a habit she had been working very hard to break, and some habits, once you've committed to breaking them, you break all the way or not at all. The eastern edge of Red Willow appeared in the gray pre-dawn like a collection of shadows that slowly agreed to have edges, and Clara sat up straighter in the saddle. There was work to do. Red Willow at 5 in the morning was a town holding its breath. The eastern approach came in behind the livery and the tannery, which meant they arrived without passing the Mason Street, which was what Ronan had intended. He knew this town the way he knew most things, not from living in it, but from having watched it long enough to understand its patterns. Where Silas's men drank, where they stayed. Which establishments had arrangements with Silas, and which ones merely tolerated him because tolerance was cheaper than the alternative. He tied the horses at a post behind the feed store and stood for a moment, reading the street with his eyes in the careful way Claire had come to recognize, the way a man looks at something when he is calculating distances and timings simultaneously. "Sable first," Clara said. He looked at her. "The widow I told you about. She's the one who'll talk, or she isn't, and if she isn't, the others won't either." Clara pulled her coat tighter. Her shoulder ached from the cold ride, and the baby had been moving restlessly for the last hour, which she was choosing to interpret as encouragement. "She's at the edge of the residential street. The house with the blue door, she told me, that when we spoke, I don't know why, but she did. She wanted you to be able to find her," Ronan said. Clara looked at him. "People tell you how to reach them," he said, "when they're hoping someone will." They found the blue door in the gray pre-dawn without difficulty. Clara knocked twice, quietly. The kind of knock that says, "I am not here to cause trouble, but I need you to open this door." There was a long silence, then the sound of movement inside. Deliberate movement, not startled someone who had been awake. The door opened 4 inches on a chain. The woman on the other side was perhaps 60, with white hair pulled back and eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that have been watching for things for a long time and have gotten very good at assessing what they see. She looked at Clara, then at Ronan standing slightly behind and to the left, then back at Clara. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said. "I need your help," Clara said. "I need you to write down what Silas did to your family and sign your name to it." Sable was quiet. "I need it today," Clara said. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it cost you last time, and I know what it might cost you again." She paused. "But he burned our barn 3 nights ago, with my children inside the house, and I am done being the only person carrying this." The chain came off the door. "Come in," Sable said. "Both of you. I'll put coffee on." The coffee was strong and the kitchen was warm, and Sable talked for 40 minutes straight with the compressed, controlled energy of someone releasing pressure that had been building for years. She talked about her husband's mine claim and the documents that had appeared, and the men who had come to the door, and the magistrate who had suddenly become unavailable. She talked about leaving their home of 20 years, with 3 months of husband's declining health, and the way he had looked at her when they drove away, like a man who has been told the world is one thing his entire life, and has just discovered it is another. Her husband had died 18 months ago. She had stayed in Red Willow because leaving felt like letting Silas win the last thing she had left to protect. She wrote for an hour. Her handwriting was precise and deliberate, and she did not need to refer to notes, because she had been carrying the facts in her body for years in the specific way that injustices are stored not in the mind exactly, but somewhere more physical, somewhere that doesn't let you forget, even when forgetting would be easier. When she signed her name, she set the pen down and looked at it. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we get more," Clara said. Sable looked at her. Then she stood up and took her coat from the hook by the door. "I know where Margaret is," she said. "And I know where the Harden boy's mother lives, and she has been wanting to say something for 3 years." She put on her coat with the efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is done deliberating. "You'll need someone who knows this town. I know this town." Ronan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Sable. "Then let's go," Clara said. What followed was the longest day Clara could remember, which was a significant statement given the last 4 months of her life. Sable moved through Red Willow with the quiet authority of a woman who had lived in a place long enough to know exactly which doors to knock on and how. She knew which people had been wronged by Silas and which ones merely disliked him, and she understood that the statement Clara needed required the first kind, not the second. Dislike was cheap. Documented injury was something a territorial investigator could use. They went to 7 houses. Not all of them said yes. A man named Prudhomme, not the auctioneer, but a different man, a carpenter with a shop on the East End, opened his door and listened to Clara for 4 minutes and then said, quietly and without hostility, that he had 2 daughters, and he was not in a position to put his name on anything that Silas swore might read. Clara did not argue with him. She understood that kind of fear because she had carried it herself, and arguing with it from the outside accomplished nothing. "Thank you for your time," she said, and meant it, and left. But 5 of the 7 said yes. A storekeeper named Aldrich, who had watched his father sign over a building for a sum that bore no relationship to its value, pressured during a period of debt that Silas had manufactured. A rancher's wife named Gertrude, who described how Silas had used his connection to a territorial water board to redirect irrigation rights away from her family's land over a dispute that began as a boundary disagreement and ended with them selling out. 2 men who had worked in a Silas-adjacent mining operation and had wages withheld through a series of legal instruments they hadn't understood until it was too late. And a woman named Iris, who had been a school teacher and who had written in a hand that made Clara think of Lucy's careful leatherwork, a precise and devastating account of watching a family run out of Red Willow County in the middle of winter because they had refused to sell Silas a piece of property he wanted. Each statement was witnessed by Clara and by Sable, and in some cases by Ronan, who stood in the corners of kitchens and parlors and said almost nothing, and whose presence seemed to help in a way Clara couldn't fully quantify something about the fact that he was there, that he had come for this, that the man who lived on the ridge had ridden down in the cold to to stand in a schoolteacher's kitchen at 10 in the morning and watch an old woman write down what she remembered. By noon, they had 6 signed statements. By mid-afternoon, word had moved through Red Willow in the way that words move through small towns, not through announcement, but through adjacency. One conversation touching another, and 2 more people came to Sable's house, while Clara was there collating the documents, asking if they were too late. They were not too late. By 4 o'clock they had 8 statements, and Sable had produced a 9th from her own writing, and Clara sat at Sable's kitchen table with the stack of papers in front of her and felt something she had to be careful about. She felt like they might actually win. She was careful about it because she had felt that before, in smaller ways, in previous towns, and each time she'd felt it, Silas had found the angle she hadn't accounted for. So she held the feeling at arm's length and focused on the next problems, which was getting the statements to the territorial investigators before Silas discovered what they were doing and found a way to interfere. Ronan had been thinking about this. "There's an investigator's office in Cardwell," he said. 2 days' ride east. "I can have Dix take the statements tonight. He's faster than anyone else I have, and Silas won't know his face. Silas might have someone watching the East Road." "Dix doesn't use the East Road," Ronan said. Clara looked at him. "He doesn't like roads," Ronan said simply, in the tone of a man who has accepted an eccentricity, because the alternative was getting a different person. She almost smiled. This was happening more often than it had in the beginning, the almost smiling, and she noticed it without examining it. "Tonight then," she said. They rode back to Ironwood Ranch on the lower trail as the light failed, the stack of statements in Clara's saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth against the cold. Ronan's left side had stiffened. During the day she could see it in the way he was compensating with his seat, slightly off balance in a direction he was clearly trying to conceal, and she did not comment on it, because commenting would produce an argument she didn't have the energy for. When they arrived, Ben was at the fence watching for them, which meant he had been watching for them long enough to be at the fence, and was trying to appear as though he had just happened to be there. "You're back," he said, with the elaborate casualness of a 7-year-old who has been scared and is relieved and is not planning to admit to either. "We're back," Clara said. She came off the horse, and Ben was immediately against her side, with his arms around her middle, his face turned in, and she held him with one arm and kissed the top of his head, and did not say anything, because nothing needed saying. Owen appeared in the doorway of the house. He looked at Ronan, first took inventory, the shoulder, the way he was moving, and then looked at Clara, and whatever he found in her face satisfied him because the set of his jaw loosened slightly. "Dix," Ronan said to Hale, who had come around the side of the house. "Here," Dix said, appearing from near the bunkhouse with the specific talent for materialization that seemed to be his native mode. "You're riding tonight," Ronan said. "East. I'll give you the route and the name. You're carrying documents for the territorial office in Cardwell, and you don't stop until you get there." Dix looked at the oilcloth package Clara was handing to Ronan. "How fast?" Dix said. "Yesterday," Ronan said. Dix took the package and was gone inside 20 minutes. Clara watched him ride out through the east end of the property, on a route that avoided both the main road and the ridge trail, and apparently existed only in his own understanding of the landscape, and she felt the documents leave her hands with the specific mixture of relief and terror that comes from committing to something you can no longer retrieve. It was done, or the first part of it was done. What came next was the waiting again, but different this time. Not the waiting of people hoping to avoid conflict, but the waiting of people who have made a move and are now watching to see what it produces. They did not have long to wait. The attack came on the 3rd morning. Clara heard the horses before she saw anything a large number of horses, more than she had heard at once since arriving at Ironwood Ranch, moving up the main approach with the deliberate pace of people who are not trying to arrive quietly. She was at the window before the sound fully registered as what it was, and Ronan was already at the door. "Get the children," he said. "I know," she said. She was already moving. She got Ben first, because Ben was the hardest to manage in a crisis, not because he panicked, but because he didn't. Because his response to danger was to become curious about it, and curiosity in a 7-year-old during an armed standoff was a specific kind of problem. She moved him to the root cellar stairs and said his name once in the tone that communicated this was not a moment for questions. Ben went. Lucy was already up, She had been sleeping lighter since the barn fire, coming awake at sounds that wouldn't have registered before. She stood in the middle of the bedroom, holding her leather piece with her eyes wide, and her face doing the controlled thing that Clara recognized now as Lucy's version of courage, the way she went very still when things were happening, instead of retreating further. "Cellar," Clara said, and held out her hand. Lucy took it. Owen was in the main room with a rifle in his hands. Clara stopped. The rifle was Ronan's, the second one he kept near the door, which Owen had clearly known about and had apparently decided applied to him this morning. He was holding it correctly, which told her that the week of checking and handling had produced actual knowledge rather than just familiarity. He was standing near the window, not in front of it. "Owen," Clara said, "I'm not going to the cellar," he said. "I know," she said, "but give me a second." She put Lucy's hand in Ben's hand and pointed at the cellar stairs. Ben, understanding the gravity of the moment with a clarity he sometimes lacked, took his sister down without argument. Clara turned to Owen. He was looking at her with that face, not the controlled face, not the watchful face, but the underneath face, the 11-year-old face that was frightened and was not going to let the fear make any decisions for it. "Protecting your family," she said, "doesn't always mean standing in front of the bullets." Started to say something. "Listen to me," she said, not loud but with enough weight that he stopped. "Right now, your brother and your sister are in that cellar. Ben is going to be frightened and he is not going to tell anyone. He's frightened because that's Ben. Lucy has been talking again for 3 days, and whatever happens in this house today, I need her to not lose that again. You are the person who can make sure those two things don't happen." She held his eyes. "That is the job right now. That is the whole job." Owen's hands on the rifle were tight. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the rifle on the table. "Okay," he said. He went to the cellar stairs and went down, and Clara heard his voice below, easy and deliberate, telling Ben something about temperance that she couldn't make out, but that had the cadence of a story, and she heard Ben respond, and she picked up the rifle Owen had set down and went to the window. Outside, the scene had arranged itself with the clarity of something that has been planned. Silas had brought more than a dozen men. They were spread across the front approach with the spacing of people who know what they're doing, not a mob, but an organized thing, organized around a central figure who sat his horse at the head of it with his silver watch chain catching the weak morning light. Silas Whitmore looked exactly as he always looked. That was if its windows were dark. That was the most terrible thing about him. He never appeared rattled, never appeared to be doing anything other than conducting business that he found mildly interesting. He had the watch chain, the good coat, and the expression of a man who has done the arithmetic and knows the answer before the problem is finished. Ronan's men were positioned hail near the barn remains at the flanking fence lines, the rest distributed with the economy of men who understand defensive positioning. They were outnumbered. Clara could count, and she could see that they were outnumbered by a number that mattered. Ronan walked out to meet Silas. Clara watched from the window with the rifle in her hands and her heart doing something complicated and irregular against her ribs. She could not hear the conversation from inside. She could read it, Silas talking, measured and unhurried, Ronan standing with his hands at his sides and his weight even, the specific stillness he went to when he was choosing not to show what he was carrying. She saw Ronan say something short. She saw Silas shake his head once and gesture to the men around him, in the way that people gesture when they are illustrating a point about numbers and proportion. Then she saw one of Silas's men move, not toward Ronan, around the side, toward the house. She stepped back from the window. Most of its windows were dark. The side door was where she went, the door that opened toward the kitchen garden she had planned on paper in those early weeks when she was committing to being here in spring. She pressed herself against the wall beside it and held the rifle in the way Owen had been shown to hold it and waited. The door opened. The man who came through was big, not tall but wide, the particular width of someone who has spent a long time doing physical labor and has the density that comes with it. He had a pistol in his hand, and he was moving with the careful efficiency of someone executing a practice task. And he did not immediately see Clara because she was not where people expect someone to be. She hit him with the rifle stock. Not a killing blow, she was aiming for the arm and caught it partly the side of his chest, and he went sideways and hit the counter, and the pistol went to the floor and slid. He came up faster than she expected, which was a problem, and she had the rifle leveled at his chest, and her hands were shaking, but not so badly that it wasn't a rifle, pointed at his chest. Stayed like that for 3 seconds. Leave, Clara said. He looked at the rifle, at her face, at the rifle again. He went back out the side door. Clara put her back against the wall and breathed for a moment, her hands shaking properly, now that there was nothing they needed to do, and then she heard the sound of gunfire from outside, not a single shot, but several, a rapid exchange that had the specific terrible randomness of a situation that has tipped into chaos, and she went back to the window. The front approach was in motion. 2 of Silas's men had dismounted and were moving toward the fence, and Hale and another man were firing from behind the water trough, and somewhere in the middle of it, Ronan was on the ground. Clara saw him go down, and her heart stopped. He was moving, she could see he was moving, pushing himself up from the ground, but his left arm wasn't cooperating, and there were 2 of Silas's men converging on him, and Hale was occupied, and the angles were wrong. Then, more of Silas's men came through the main gate. It happened fast enough that the sequence became confused. 3 men dismounted and moved toward Hale's position, and Hale's partner went down not killed. Clara could see him moving, but he was down, and Hale couldn't cover 2 positions and the fence line at once, and the numbers that had mattered from the beginning were now mattering all at once. Ronan was taken. They moved him to his feet and had his arms, and he was conscious and standing but not fighting, because fighting was not the available option at that moment. He looked toward the house, found the window where Clara was standing, and his face was controlled and present, and something under that. She read as, "Stay inside. Stay with the children." Silas dismounted. He walked through his own men toward the house door, with the unhurried pace of a man arriving for a scheduled appointment. He knocked. It was such an absurd, ordinary gesture, a knock, that it took Clara a full second to process it. Then he opened the door. He stood in the doorway of Ironwood Ranch and looked at Clara with his watch chain and his expression that found everything mildly interesting, and behind him through the open door she could see his men, and Ronan held between 2 of them, and Hale on his knees at the fence, and the ranch that had been a refuge for 6 weeks, sitting under a gray sky, with ash where the barn used to be. "Clara," he said. He still didn't call her Mercer. He never had. "This has gone on long enough." "Yes," Clara said. "It has. Come out. Bring the children. We'll settle the rest of this sensibly." He looked at the rifle in her hands with the expression of a man who does not consider it a serious variable. "You're not going to shoot your husband's brother." "He's not my husband's brother," Clara said. "He's a man who used documents and debts and fear to take everything my husband's family ever had, and I'm not going to call that a family relationship." Silas tilted his head slightly. "You've gotten bold." "I've gotten clear," Clara said. "There's a difference. You have nowhere to go," he said. "Your men are down. Your tracker," as he glanced back at Ronan, a dismissive gesture, occupied. "Your documents, whatever you think you collected in Red Willow, aren't going to matter once this is settled privately." He looked at her steadily. "I want the children, Clara. I want them in a proper household with proper resources and proper standing. What you have here is..." He looked at the kitchen, the plain walls, the pot on the hook. "Nothing." "I know what I have," Clara said. "Then you know it isn't enough. I have 8 signed statements from people in Red Willow County that the territorial investigator in Cardwell received yesterday afternoon," Clara said. "I have your own windows were dark. I have your own correspondence these your men were carrying when they came to this property which Ronan kept, and which describe in your handwriting what you plan to do here. And I have a barn that didn't burn itself." She watched his face do something. "By my estimate, the territorial officers are already on the road. So yes, I know what I have." Silas's expression changed. Not dramatically. A small tightening around the eyes, a slight reordering of the features, as if something inside had shifted 1 degree. "You're bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Clara said. It was not a question. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the room, at the kitchen, at the table, at the cellar door, that he had apparently not noticed. His eyes stopped on the cellar door. "The children are in the house," he said. "My children," Clara said, "are not your concern. They are absolutely my The cellar door burst open. Owen came through it at a run, and it happened so fast that Silas turned before he had time to think, and in turning put his back to Clara for 2 full seconds. And Owen did not have a rifle. Clara had taken the rifle, but what he had was a length of iron pipe he had apparently found in the root cellar, and what he did with it was hit the pistol out of Silas Whitmore's right hand with a swing that had every ounce of 11-year-old fury and 4 months of running behind it. The pistol went into the corner. Silas made a sound and grabbed his hand. Owen put himself between Silas and his mother. For a moment, everything stopped. Then Clara moved. She had the rifle, and she was at the door before Silas had recalibrated, and outside the sounds of the standoff had shifted. There was shouting from the east end of the property, a different quality to the shouting, and she came through the door in time to see what was changing. Riders. Coming down the main road from the east, more than she could count quickly, and they were not Silas's men, their approach was different, organized differently, with a lead rider carrying something she couldn't identify at distance. Territorial insignia. She identified it at the same moment Silas's men identified it, and what happened after that had the rapid, definitive quality of things that have been building long enough that when they finally resolve, they resolve completely. Silas's men looked at the approaching riders, looked at each other. 3 of them were on their horses and moving toward the east gate before anyone with authority had said anything, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how much loyalty Silas's money actually purchased once the arithmetic changed. Ronan broke free. He used the distraction the moment when the 2 men holding him looked east instead of at him, with the efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly one thing and was ready for it the moment it appeared. He went forward instead of back, which was not what the men expected, and the one on his right went down, and the other released his arm, and Ronan turned, and his face was different now, the contained thing gone, something much older and much more immediate in its place. He looked at the house. Clara was standing in the doorway. She was upright, she was in one piece. Covered the distance between them in a way that was not side was wrong, and his shoulder was wrong, and he was moving with the particular urgent gracelessness of a man whose body is being asked to do things it's not currently capable of and is doing them anyway. And he stopped in front of her, and his breathing was ragged, and he looked at her face. "The children," he said. "Cellar," she said. Owen came out. "The other 2 are—" "I know," he said. "I heard." He looked at Owen, who was still in the doorway behind Clara with the iron pipe in his hands and Silas's pistol on the floor behind him, and an expression that was equal parts terror and something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Ronan looked at the boy for a long moment. "You came out of the cellar," Ronan said. "Yes," Owen said. "Your mother told you to stay." "She told me not to stand in front of the bullets," Owen said. He didn't have the gun anymore. Something moved through Ronan's face that he made no attempt to control. "Get Ben and Lucy," he said. Owen went. Outside, the territorial officers had reached the main approach, and Silas's remaining men were in various stages of compliance and non-compliance, and the officer in charge was a compact, serious woman named Braddock, who clearly had no interest in anyone's explanations until she'd established basic order, which she did with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before. Silas was in the doorway of the house. He had his hand pressed against his chest, where the pistol had been hid away, and his expression was no longer the mildly interested one. It was something Clara had not seen on his face in 4 months of being pursued by him, which was the expression of a man discovering that the world he believed was arranged in his favor has quietly rearranged itself without telling him. Officer Braddock came to the door. "Silas Whitmore," she said. "I want my attorney," Silas said. "You'll have your attorney," she said. "Most of its windows were dark. You'll also have an accounting session tomorrow morning in which we'll be reviewing a considerable amount of correspondence that arrived in Cardwell yesterday." She looked at him without inflection. "Your attorney's going to be very busy." Silas looked at Clara. His expression was not hateful. It was something worse than hateful it was. The look of a man who has decided that what has happened is a temporary misarrangement that will be corrected, that people like Clara Mercer do not permanently outmaneuver people like Silas Whitmore, and that he is simply experiencing a delay in the outcome he has already decided is correct. Clara looked back at him. She had spent 4 months being afraid of that expression. 4 months in which the certainty on his face had been the thing that made her feel smallest, most temporary, most like a problem he was eventually going to solve. She was not afraid of it now. She didn't know what she was instead of afraid. Something quieter. Something that felt more permanent than fear. "Take him," Clara said to Officer Braddock. Braddock looked at her with the slight evaluation of someone recalibrating their initial assessment. Then she nodded. And Silas Whitmore was walked out of Ironwood Ranch in the cold morning light, and Clara watched him go from the doorway with her rifle in her hands and her back straight, and the watch chain caught the light one last time as he went, and then he was around the corner, and she could not see it anymore. Behind her, she heard the cellar door and then Ben's voice, elevated and asking several questions simultaneously, and Lucy's smaller voice, saying something she couldn't make out, and Owen answering them both in the patient cadence of someone who has appointed himself the information source. Ronan came to stand beside her in the doorway. He didn't touch her. He stood with his damaged shoulder and his wrong-moving left side and his breathing that hadn't fully settled yet, and he looked at the yard where Braddock's officers were processing Silas's men with the brisk thoroughness of people with a lot to process. It worked, he said. Most of it, Clara said. We lost the barn. Already had plans for a better barn, he said. She looked at him. I didn't tell you that, he said. The old one was poorly positioned. Had a draft problem since October. She almost laughed. Almost. Ben came through the door at speed and wrapped both arms around Ronan's middle around his damaged side, which made Ronan make a short, involuntary sound and pressed his face in. Are you hurt? Ben said, his voice muffled by Ronan's coat. Some, Ronan said. How much some? Enough to need soup later, Ronan said. Not enough to require sympathy right now. Ben tightened his arms carefully. Ronan put his right hand on the back of Ben's head. Lucy came to stand beside Clara, and Clara looked down and found her daughter watching the yard with her leather piece in both hands and her face, that careful, controlled face. And then Lucy looked up at Clara. He's gone, she said. He's gone, Clara said. Lucy nodded. She looked at the yard for another moment. Then she held out the leather piece, not to give it away, but for Clara to look at. She had added more holes since the last time Clara had seen it. She had completed an interior pattern inside the first ring, smaller holes in a secondary circuit, painstaking and uneven and genuinely there. I'm going to need more leather, Lucy said. Clara looked at the piece. She looked at her daughter's face. I'll ask Ronan, she said. Owen had come out and was standing at the edge of the porch looking at the territorial officers and the captured men and the whole complex aftermath with the evaluating expression of a boy taking inventory of a situation he had participated in. He still had the iron pipe in his right hand. Clara was fairly certain he had forgotten he was holding it. Ronan looked at him. Owen looked back. There was a long pause in which something passed between them that Clara could not fully see man to boy, or something moving in that direction, some things that had been building in the weeks of fence posts and rifle checks and shared meals, and one morning, when the world had needed to be held together. Post-hole diggers going to need new handles, Ronan said. When the ground thaws. Owen looked at him. I'll show you how to fit them, Ronan said, if you want. Owen set the iron pipe down against the porch rail. Yeah, he said. Okay. And in the cold morning of a day that had started with fire and armed men and a cellar and a silver watch chain, that was the sentence that undid Clara Mercer more completely than any of the rest of it. That plain, functional okay, that agreement to learn something from someone you had decided to trust. She turned away before Owen could see her face. She looked at the ridge. The snow from 3 days ago had settled and compressed, and the ridge looked exactly, as it always looked, permanent and indifferent, and simply there, as ridges are, without opinion about what happens at their feet. Inside the house, Hale was apparently being bandaged by Dix, who had appeared sometime in the chaos from a direction nobody had specifically tracked and had his own opinions about wound management. Through the open door, Clara could hear Hale objecting to something, and Dix responding in the flat, unhurried tone he used when he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Officer Braddock approached the porch. She had a notebook and a pen and the expression of someone with a significant amount of work to do, and a professional relationship with significant amounts of work. Mrs. Mercer, she said. Clara turned. I'm going to need your account of this morning, Braddock said, and anything additional you can tell me about the correspondence we received. We have the statements from Red Willow County and the letters she checked her notebook, your husband preserved from the original confrontations. What I need now is your account, personally. What happened here, what preceded it, and what you know. Clara looked at the ridge again, briefly. Then she looked at Braddock. How much time do you have? Clara said. Braddock's expression shifted fractionally. Not quite a smile, but close. As much as you need, she said. Clara sat down on the porch step, which was not a dignified position, but was what was available, and she put her hands in her lap, and she began at the beginning, which was a quarry and a collapse and a man with a silver watch chain who had decided that grief made people manageable. Around her slowly, the ranch settled. Men were led away. Officers took notes. Hale emerged from inside with his arm in a sling and a complaint about Dix's methods. Ben found Temperance in the west paddock and went to report to her in person on the morning's events. Lucy sat beside Clara on the step and held her leather piece. And Owen stood at the porch rail with Ronan beside him, not talking, watching the last of Silas's men go down the main road under escort. And whatever was on Owen's face in that moment, Clara caught only in profile just the edge of it before it was gone and replaced by the ordinary controlled face again. But she had seen it. Relief was the wrong word. It was something more specific than relief. It was the look of a boy who has been holding up a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just discovered that someone is standing beside him and that the thing, divided between two sets of hands, is actually a manageable weight. She turned back to Braddock and kept talking. There was still work to do, but the shape of the work was different now. It was the work of after, not the work of before, and Clara Mercer had been waiting long enough for after that she was prepared to do every last part of it. Officer Braddock stayed at Ironwood Ranch for 3 days. She slept in the bunkhouse with 2 of her officers and worked at the kitchen table with a methodical precision that Clara found both reassuring and exhausting, because Braddock's precision required Clara to be equally precise, to hold the sequence of events in order and deliver them in the organized way that an official account required, rather than the fragmented, non-linear way that memory actually stored them. They went through everything. The quarry death and the debt instruments Silas had used in its aftermath. The towns Clara had passed through and the specific mechanisms of each displacement, the magistrate in one place, creditor in another, the document that appeared and the door that closed the auction in Frost Hollow, the deputy's visit with the guardianship petition, the wedding, the 3 riders in the yard, the barn fire, the tracks at the tree line, the morning of the attack and Silas walking through the door of Ironwood Ranch as if he owned it, which was, Braddock noted with the flat tone of someone who has seen a great deal, consistent with his pattern. His pattern, Clara said. He has done versions of this before, Braddock said. She did not elaborate immediately, looking at her notes with the focused attention of someone fitting pieces to a shape they already recognize. Not always families. Sometimes individuals, sometimes businesses. The mechanism is the same debt instruments, legal pressure, isolation. She looked up. You're not the first person he's pursued this way. You're the first one who collected evidence while he was pursuing you. Clara absorbed this. The others, she said, what happened to them? Braddock held her gaze. Some left the territory. Some assigned things over. One family, she stopped. It's in the record. You can read it if you want. I don't want, Clara said. I want to know that what we gave you is enough. Between the statements from Red Willow, the letters your husband's men preserved, and your account, Braddock said, yes, it's enough. A pause. The letters are particularly useful. People in Silas's position often make the mistake of believing their written instructions are private. They're not. They're documentation. Ronan had kept every letter, every written instruction his men had recovered during the confrontations, every document that had arrived at the ranch with the deputies and riders Silas had sent. He had folded them and stored them in a box on the shelf above the kitchen table without explaining what he was doing or why. And when Clara had asked him about it in the first week, he had said simply that a man who writes things down believes his version of events is the one that will be read, and it was useful to collect his version before he had the chance to revise it. She had not fully understood at the time. She understood now. Silas was held in the Cardwell Territorial Facility pending formal proceedings. Braddock told Clara this on the second day with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a logistical update, and Clara received it the same way, which was the only way she had left to receive anything after 4 months of crisis practically, without ceremony, putting it in the column of facts that were now true and moving to the next thing. Proceedings, Braddock explained, would take time. Months, possibly. The territory moved at its own pace, and the number of complaints against Silas was larger than the statements from Red Willow Braddock's office had been receiving information from other counties as word moved through the line. Territory that someone had finally filed and been heard. People who had stayed silent for years were writing letters. People who had left the territory were being contacted. He will not be returning to this county, Braddock said on the third morning when she and her officers were preparing to leave. She said it with the specific care of someone who wants to be accurate, without making promises she can't guarantee, but also with a weight under it that told Clara this was as close to a promise as Braddock was going to give. What about the guardianship petition? Clarissa said. Withdrawn, Braddock said. His attorney filed the withdrawal yesterday. When a man's primary legal problem becomes criminal rather than civil, guardianship petitions become a low priority. She looked at Clara steadily. Your children are yours, Mrs. Mercer. They were always yours. The law was never actually on his side, he was just betting. You wouldn't find that out before he won. Clara stood in the yard and watched Braddock's party ride east, and the morning was cold and clear, and the ash of the old barn was covered by the snow that had fallen overnight, which made the absence of it less visible but not less real. Hale came to stand beside her. What happens? He said. We build a barn, Clara said. He looked at her. Ronan said the old one was poorly positioned, she said. Draft problem. Hale made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. That's true, he said, it was. The men stayed another week. Not because there was an immediate threat, but because there was real work. There was always real work on a ranch that had just had its barn burned, and a significant piece of its fence line compromised in an armed standoff, and because Ironwood Ranch had, in the weeks of waiting and defending, become the kind of place that these men moved through differently than they'd arrived. Less like visitors, more like something that didn't have a clean word. Dick spent 2 days working on the root cellar with Owen, reinforcing what Ronan had done with what Dick's considered to be improvements, which Owen evaluated seriously and adopted selectively, which made Dix regard the boy with the particular respect that skilled people have for other skilled people who don't simply defer. Ben continued his relationship with Temperance, which had evolved into something reciprocal. The horse had apparently decided that Ben's was acceptable company, which Hale said was more than most people got from Temperance, and Ben received as the highest possible honor. Lucy had more leather. Ronan had found a larger piece in his supplies and cut it to a workable size without comment, and Lucy had set up her operation at the corner of the kitchen table with the systematic focus of someone who has identified what they want to do and is now doing as much as possible before anyone suggests they stop. She was working on something with a deliberate pattern, not random holes, but an actual design, a series of interlocking rings that she was executing slowly and with real concentration. She talked more now, not constantly. Lucy was not going to be a constant talker. That was not who she was. Even before the quarry, she had been a child who chose her words carefully and valued quiet. But she talked in the natural way of a child who has things to say and says them when they're relevant, and she asked questions, and she told Ronan one afternoon that Temperance liked Ben better than she liked Owen, and when Ronan asked how she could tell, and when Ronan asked, she explained the reasoning in detail that suggested she had been observing Temperance's behavior for weeks and drawing conclusions. Ronan listened to all of it. He had a specific quality when he listened to Lucy that Clara had noticed early and never stopped noticing: a complete stillness, an absence of the impatience that adults so often brought to children's observations, as if he understood that what Lucy said was worth the same attention as what anyone said. One evening, about 2 weeks after Braddock left, Clara found him at the kitchen table after the children were down, with a small piece of leather in his hands. Not his usual piece, smaller, more deliberate. He was punching holes in a pattern that she recognized. He was working on the interlocking rings. She stood in the doorway and watched him work. He knew she was there. He always knew when someone was in a room, which was such a consistent quality that she had stopped being surprised by it, but he didn't look up. She showed you the pattern, Clara said. Ask me to try it, he said. It's harder than it looks. The spacing has to be exactly right, or the rings don't close. Clara sat down across from him. The lamp was between them, the same as the night he'd written 6 small, steady handwriting while she sat across the table. The house was quiet, except for the wind off the ridge, which had its own particular nighttime voice that she had learned in the weeks of living here, the sound that meant weather was coming versus the sound that meant it was simply passing through. "Ronan," she said. He looked up. "You said something on the trail to Red Willow," she said, "about a door." He waited. "You said when this was over." "I should know the door was there," she said. "That whatever we built to survive this, you didn't expect me to keep it if I didn't want to." "I remember," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She looked at the leather piece in his hands, the rings he was trying to close. "I don't want the door." He was very still. "Not because I feel obligated," she said. "I need you to hear that specifically. Not because of the $14 or the roof or any of it." She paused. "Because of the porridge, the gate latch, the way you sat on the floor and didn't talk to Lucy, the box of letters on the shelf." She looked at his face. "Because of its night we sat here, and you told me about your wife and your children, and you said what it was like to arrive after, and I understood something about you that I think you hadn't told many people." Ronan set the leather down. "Clara," he said. "I'm not finished," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not saying this is simple. I'm not saying I'm not still somewhere inside the grief of losing Caleb, because I am, and I expect I will be for a long time, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." And most of its windows were dark. "I know this started as a legal arrangement, and I know you've been careful. I know how careful you've been. I've seen it every single day, and I know you think that careful is what I needed." "It is what you needed," he said. "It was," she agreed. "And now I need something different." She met his eyes. "I need to know if you're still in this. Not the arrangement. This." The lamp held steady between them. Ronan looked at her for a long moment, the careful, unhurried look he gave to things that mattered. "I have been in this," he said, "since the auction yard." It was not a romantic speech. It was not constructed for effect. It had the particular quality of a true thing said plainly by someone who doesn't make a habit of unnecessary ornament. Clara nodded. She reached across the table and picked up the leather piece he'd set down. Looked at the rings he'd been working. "Your spacing is off on the third one," she said. He looked. "The left side," she said. "You've got an extra hole." He took it back. Looked at it. Made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and mild frustration. "Lucy's going to notice," Clara said. "Lucy notices everything," he said. "Yes," Clara said, "she does." The baby came 6 weeks later. It came at night, which was not surprising babies in Clara's experience. Had a preference for the least convenient timing, as if they understood that arrival should require effort from everyone involved. The labor was long, longer than the previous 3 had been, which Clara attributed to the fact that she had spent the last 6 months running and defending and being afraid, none of which was ideal preparation for bringing a person into the world. Sable came. Clara had written to her after Braddock left, a letter that had no particular purpose, saying what Clara was bad at saying in person, which was "Thank you for opening the blue door, and thank you for your handwriting, and thank you for putting your coat on and walking with us through Red Willow County in the cold." Sable had practiced a brief letter that contained practical information about a midwife she trusted and an offer that Clara hadn't asked for and had not refused. So Sable was there, and the midwife was there, and Ronan was in the main room with the children at a distance that was close enough to be reachable and far enough to be appropriate. Clara could hear Owen's voice through the wall periodically, not the words, but the cadence he was talking, which was how Owen managed things he couldn't control, talked steadily about ordinary subjects, as if the ordinariness itself was a stabilizing force. She heard Ben ask a question. She heard Lucy's voice, brief and certain, apparently answering it. It was a girl. They knew it was a girl approximately 3 seconds after she arrived, which was when she expressed her opinion about the situation with a clarity that required no interpretation. The midwife laughed. Sable sat back in the chair she'd been occupying for the last 4 hours with the expression of a woman who has been through enough births to understand which parts require anxiety and which parts are simply the world continuing. "She's loud," Sable observed. "Good," Clara said. She held her daughter, and the baby's face was the complicated, provisional face of someone who has just been introduced to a situation they didn't ask to be in and is still forming opinions. Dark hair. Ronan's jaw was the thought that crossed Clara's mind immediately, which surprised her and didn't surprise her at the same time. She named her June. for the turn from cold to warm, for the idea that seasons are not permanent in either direction, that winter ends and summer eventually goes too, and then winter comes again. And none of it is a verdict on anything. Just the world moving through its cycle the way it always has. For the warmth that had been coming, slowly and unevenly, and without announcement, into Ironwood Ranch. Ronan came in when Sable called him. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had Owen behind him and Ben trying to see around both of them, and Lucy standing at his left side with her hand in his, which was something she had started doing in the weeks after the attack, not constantly, not with the desperation of a frightened child, but occasionally, as a choice, because she had decided it was available to her. Clara looked at him over the baby's head. He looked at June. His face did something that she had never seen it do before, not the careful look, not the calculating look, not the controlled thing it went to under pressure. Something much less managed. Something that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Owen's face on the platform in Frost Hollow, when his fists had come down that first half-inch. Something like the beginning of trust. June? Clara said. Her name is June. Ronan nodded, still looking at the baby. Ben had successfully negotiated his way past Ronan's other side and was now at the bed with his eyes very wide and an expression of total astonishment, as if the concept of babies had been theoretical until this moment and reality had significantly exceeded the description. She's very small, he said. You were smaller, Clara said. I don't believe that, Ben said. Owen had come in and was standing at the foot of the bed, crossed in the way he crossed his arms when he was feeling something large, and was managing it by taking up a defensive posture. He looked at June. He looked at Clara. He looked at the window. She looks like Lucy did, he said. When Lucy was born, Clara looked at him. Dad said that, Owen said. He said when Lucy came, he said babies look like old men who've had a very tiring journey. He looked at the window again, jaw working. I remembered that just now. The room was quiet. He was right, Clara said. That's exactly what he said. Owen nodded. Lucy had come around to stand beside Clara and was looking at June with the focused, evaluating expression she brought to everything that interested her. Can I hold her later? Lucy said. Later, Clarissa said, when she's used to things. Lucy looked at June for another moment. I'm going to make her something, Lucy said. With the leather. She'll like that, Clara said. Sable eventually moved everyone out with the firm expertise of a woman who understood that new mothers needed the room cleared, and the house settled into its nighttime sounds, and Clara lay with June against her chest and listened to the ridge wind and the particular quality of quiet that a house has when it contains sleeping children and people who are not quite asleep. The door opened. Ronan came in with a cup of tea and set it on the table beside the bed and started to leave. Sit down, Clara said. He sat in the chair. They stayed like that for a while, her with the baby, him in the chair, the tea cooling on the table in the specific companionable quiet that has to be built over time, that cannot be manufactured or rushed, that arrives only after enough hours have been shared, that silence becomes its own form of communication. She's going to have opinions, Ronan said finally. Clara looked down at June, who was sleeping with the comprehensive commitment of someone who has just completed a significant amount of work. All my children have opinions, Clara said. I know, Ronan said. I'm prepared. She looked at him over the baby's head. Are you? She said. Not a challenge, a genuine question, the kind that deserves a genuine answer. He thought about it, which she had learned was what he did with questions that deserved it. He actually considered them rather than answering at the speed of reassurance. No, he said, but I'll manage. It was such an honest answer that she laughed, which woke June briefly, who expressed an opinion and then went back to sleep. Silas Whitmore's proceedings ran through the spring and into early summer. Clara was called to Cardwell once to give testimony, which she did in a room with wooden floors and high windows, and a territorial judge who appeared to be approximately 90 years old, but had eyes that were completely present and a quality of attention that missed nothing. She said what she had said to Braddock, in the same order, with the same specificity. She answered questions from Silas's attorney with the flat patience of a woman who has been afraid, and is no longer afraid, and finds the instruments of fear significantly less impressive, now that she can see them clearly. Silas sat at his table across the room in his good coat without the watch chain, which someone had apparently decided was inappropriate for the proceedings. Without it, he looked smaller. Not physically smaller, he was still a large man but dimensionally smaller. as if some of his mass had been composed of the certainty that he was untouchable, and that certainty had been quietly removed. He did not look at Clara during her testimony. She looked at him. Most of its windows were dark. The judge allowed the full record of statements, all 11, that had ultimately been collected from Red Willow County and 2 other counties where similar complaints had been filed after Braddock's investigation became known. He allowed the letters. He allowed Braddock's account of the morning at Ironwood Ranch and the organized nature of the attack. Silas was convicted on 4 counts, including 2 that Clara had not specifically filed additional complaints from people who had found their courage once they saw that courage produced results. His property was ordered liquidated to compensate the families he had defrauded. The list of those families was longer than Clara had known, which made her feel 2 things simultaneously: sorrow for all the people who had been in the path of this man's particular appetites, and something like relief that she had not, after all, been uniquely foolish in being caught. She was offered compensation. She refused it. She asked instead that her share go towards something specific, a school in Red Willow County, and a small fund for families who arrived in the territory, though without resources, and needed somewhere to be while they found their footing. She had been that family. She knew what it needed, which was less charity and more structure, somewhere with a door that opened, somewhere that didn't require you to have already solved your problem to qualify for help with it. The judge looked at her when she made this request. "That's an unusual use of restitution," he said. "I'm an unusual claimant," Clara said. He considered this. "Granted," he said. She rode back to Ironwood Ranch in the early summer. Alone Ronan had offered to come, and she had told him she needed to do this part herself, which he had accepted without argument. Most of its windows were dark, which was one of the things she had come to rely on most about him, that he understood the difference between support and encroachment. The territory looked different in summer than it had in the winter she had arrived in. The ridge was green rather than white, and the grass in the lower pastures had come up in the serious way of grass that intends to stay, and the new barn, which Ronan and Hale and Owen had spent 6 weeks building in the spring, with Dix's modifications and Ben's enthusiastic, but largely counterproductive assistance, stood where the old one had been, positioned 3 feet north and 20 degrees east to correct the draft problem. It was not a beautiful barn. It was a functional barn, built by people who knew what they were doing and cared about it being right rather than about it being impressive. It looked like it intended to stand for a long time. Clara pulled her horse to a stop at the top of the approach and looked at it. Ironwood Ranch in June was not the same place it had been in January. Some of this was the season, and some of it was the work, and some of it was something harder to name, the specific quality that a place accumulates when people have made decisions inside it. Not all of them good decisions, not all of them that worked out, but real ones, made by real people for reasons that had more to do with love than with strategy, even when they were telling themselves it was strategy. Owen came out of the barn when he heard the horse. He was taller. She had noticed this in increments over the months, but seeing him now, after 2 days away, she saw it plainly. He was taller. And something about his face had changed too, or maybe not changed but settled, the way faces settle when a person has found the shape they're going to live in. "How'd it go?" "Done," she said. He nodded. "Ronan said you'd say that." "Just done, nothing else." "Ronan knows me," Clara said. Owen almost smiled. It wasn't all the way a smile. It was the partial thing Owen did when something's amused him that he hadn't decided whether to admit was amusing. But it was there, and it was his father's almost smile, and Clara received it with the specific bittersweet precision of a woman who has learned to hold grief and joy in the same hand because they refuse to be separated. "June's been yelling," Owen reported, "since about noon." "She has opinions," Clara said. "Yeah," he said. "She really does." She got down from the horse, and Owen took the reins, which he did now without being asked, which was such a small and enormous thing simultaneously. She walked to the house and came through the door, and the sound hit her immediately. June, at high volume from the main room, which meant Ronan was managing June, which she confirmed by coming around the corner. He was walking back and forth across the main room in the deliberate pace of someone who has been walking in that direction for some time. June was against his right shoulder. He still favored the right. The left never fully came back to what it had been before the attack, and she was expressing her views about something with complete commitment. He looked up when Clara came in. She's not interested in sleeping, he said. She never is, Clara said. I've tried everything. Except putting her down, Clara said. She gets louder when I put her down. She gets louder and then she goes to sleep, Clara said. You have to wait out the louder. That seems counterintuitive, Ronan said. Everything about babies is counterintuitive, Clara said. You get used to it. He looked at the baby. June was watching him with the focused, imperious attention she brought to everything, which had turned out to be her primary characteristic, and which Ben had identified in her second week as evidence that she was going to be a lot, an assessment that had proven accurate. Did it go all right? Ronan said, meaning Cardwell, meaning the testimony and the judge and the room with the wooden floors. It's done, Clara said. He won't be coming back. Ronan nodded once. And the compensation, he said. School, Clara said, and a fund for families. He looked at her. I didn't want his money, she said. I wanted it to mean something other than what it meant to him. Ronan looked at June, who had quieted incrementally, not asleep, but considering it. That sounds like you, he said. Is that a criticism? She said. No, he said. It's just true. She crossed the room and took June from him, and June immediately began renegotiating, and Clara walked the same path Ronan had been walking, and June was loud for 3 minutes, and then went quiet, and then went to sleep in the sudden comprehensive way that babies went to sleep, as if sleep was a decision they made all at once, rather than gradually. Ronson sat down at the kitchen table. He had paper in front of him. He was writing something, which he did occasionally, and she had learned not to ask about it immediately, because he would show her when Azeng was ready. And asking then produced a conversation he clearly found uncomfortable. Put June down in the small bed they'd made her in the corner and stood for a moment watching her sleep, the way parents stand watching sleeping children, because the sleeping child is the version of the person that contains the most of what you love about them without anything else in the way. Ben came in from outside, covered in something she decided not to identify. Is she asleep? He whispered, with a loudness that rather defeated the purpose of whispering. Yes, Clara said at a normal volume, and you need to go wash before supper. Ben looked at his hands. I found something interesting in the east pasture, he said. I don't doubt it, Clara said. Go wash, he went. Lucy came in behind him, without whatever had covered Ben, because Lucy moved through the world without attracting its debris in the way that Ben attracted it. She went directly to the table and sat across from Ronan and looked at what he was writing. He tilted it toward her. She read it. Her lips moved slightly. That's for me, she said. It's for the territorial school records, Ronan said. Enrollment. Lucy looked at the paper. For fall? She said. If you want, he said. Red Willow School, starting up again. The fund your mother set up is helping with it. Lucy looked at Clara. Clara met her eyes. Do you want to go to school? Clara said. Lucy considered this with the seriousness she brought to all considerations. Yes, she said. I think I have a lot to learn. It was such a Lucy thing to say, not excited, not resistant, just practical. Just the assessment of a child who has been observing the world carefully and has concluded that more information is indicated that Ronan looked down at the paper and Clara looked at the ceiling, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Okay, Ronan said. I'll finish the form. Autumn came to Ironwood Ranch the way it came to the territory without apology, just a gradual insistence on red and gold in the trees along the ridge, and a different quality to the light in the afternoons and mornings that arrived later and colder than they had the week before. Clara stood on the porch one evening and watched Ronan working on the paddock fence with Owen beside him. They were fitting a new section of rail, and Ronan was explaining something about the way the post had to be set to account for the freeze and thaw cycle, and Owen was listening and asking questions, real questions, the specific questions of someone learning rather than performing interest. And Ronan was answering them with the patient exactness of someone who wants the thing to be understood correctly the first time. Ben was in the paddock itself, which was technically not supposed to happen while fencing was in progress. But somehow Ben was always in the place that was technically not supposed to happen and had survived it thus far, and Temperance was following him around the paddock with the relaxed companionship of a horse that has fully accepted a person. Lucy was under the cottonwood at the edge of the yard with a book. She read the way she did everything completely, without reservation, as if the book was the only thing in the world while she was in it. She had gotten through Sable's collection in the summer and was now working through what the Red Willow School had lent her, and she had opinions about all of it that she shared at supper, in the slightly formal way she had of presenting an argument she had been developing in her own mind for a while before speaking it. June was asleep in the house, because June was either asleep or loud, and nothing in between. Clara leaned on the porch rail and looked at all of it. The whole arrangement of people and animals, and an autumn evening, and fence work, and a book under a tree, and thought about what Caleb would have made of it. He would have found it funny. That was the first thing. He would have found the whole shape of it funny, in the way he found things funny, not dismissively, not cruelly, but with the genuine surprised delight of a man who thought the world was basically absurd and meant that as a compliment. He would have said something to make her laugh, and then he would have gotten serious underneath and said what he meant, which was, "This is good, Clara. This is how it's supposed to be." She didn't talk to Caleb. That was not something she did. But she thought about what he would have said, and she let it sit in her for a moment. The way you let warmth sit in you on a cold evening, you don't hold on to it too tightly. You just let it be there. And when it fades, it doesn't take everything with it. Ronan glanced at the porch. Their eyes met across the yard. He didn't wave. She didn't wave. They just registered each other. The way people register each other when they have become the kind of permanent that stops requiring acknowledgement every time and just sits in the background as a fact about the world. Then he said something to Owen, and Owen looked at the porch too, and then quickly looked away in the practiced manner of a 12-year-old who has decided that noticing things between adults is something he is not going to do. Clara almost smiled. She thought about the auction platform. She thought about $14 and a hammer and a man who walked toward her across a yard while everybody watched and said, "Where we're going, nobody gets to sell your family again." She thought about what she had believed in that moment, which was that the world had decided her worth, and the decision was final. She had been wrong about that. Not because someone rescued her, that was not what had happened. Or not only what had happened. Ronan had bought time. He had bought a roof and a door and a month before the next disaster, and what happened inside that time had been the choices she made and the courage her children carried, and the anger of a widow in Red Willow County who had kept her handwriting neat for 3 years while waiting for someone to come to the blue door. No one had handed her back her worth. She had taken it back herself. That was the thing since she understood. Now that she hadn't understood in the first weeks of running, that worth is not something that can be auctioned away or petitioned away or burned away, but it is also not something that reasserts itself automatically. You have to walk back toward it, even when you're 6 months pregnant and 31 cents, poor and your youngest child has stopped speaking. You have to keep walking toward it, one step and one day and one signed statement at a time, and eventually you get there, and when you do, it belongs to you in a way that nothing and nobody can revoke. The fence section went in. Owen checked it, running his hand along the top rail the way Ronan had taught him, testing for level. He nodded once the nod he gave when something was adequately done, and Ronan saw it, and that corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved. Ben said something from inside the paddock that made Owen look at him and say his name in the particular long-suffering tone that older brothers produce without effort. Under the cottonwood, Lucy turned a page. Inside the house, June slept. And Clara Mercer stood on the porch of Ironwood Ranch in the autumn evening and breathed in and out and let the ordinary, extraordinary weight of it settle over her without trying to name all of it or hold all of it or be prepared for what came next. Because what came next was simply more of this, more days, and fence work, and books, and supper, and a baby who had opinions, and a boy who was becoming a man, and a daughter who was reclaiming the world one word at a time. Something she had learned: you don't survive, you become them. And the family that everyone had decided was finished. The family that had been driven town to town, and auctioned and petitioned, and burned out and outnumbered was not finished. It was, in the most honest and unadorned sense of the word, just beginning.